So welcome all to our event featuring Carter Carter. I'm going to pass the event off to Sarah Jenkins to introduce him.
Hi all, good morning, and thank you so much for attending this event. I'm Sarah Jenkins, I'm Secretary of the Section 9 Board, and I am so pleased and delighted to introduce Carter Carter, who will be speaking with us today. He is Assistant Professor of Clinical Psychology at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. He's a lecturer at the Doctorate Social Work program at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice. He's also affiliated faculty at the Program for Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I know him well as a friend. He's also a beloved professor and mentor to clinicians near and far, many of whom are now involved in the Division 39. He is a proud union organizer with the Massachusetts State College Association. He's a clinical social worker with a private practice in psychotherapy and clinical supervision, and somehow also a father of two and a farmer with a lot of cows and delicious vegetables that he cultivates, and a regular contributor of delicious recipes to his local newspaper. So please welcome this extraordinary individual who I'm so excited to hear speak today. Carter, take it away.
Thanks, Fran. Oh my God. I'm thrilled to be here. I got a lot of screens on my computer that I have to move around. I'm sorry if I look a little funny because I'm reading 3 things at once this whole day. So I'm going to, in a way that's very unlike me, I'm going to be reading from prepared remarks today for reasons I think will become apparent. I really wanted to choose my word. Thank you, Tara. Thank you for all of you. So something y'all might not think about, which I doubt you'll find surprising when I say it, is that doing the kind of research I'm here to tell you about today is like absolutely horribly painful. The materials I have to close read and analyze are so bigoted and so cynically focused on disguising their bigotry in reasonable terms that they like make me psychically and physically nauseous. I had a similar experience where reams upon reams of bigoted and homicidal and suicidal journals and stuff. But that was history and the perpetrators were dead. What I'm writing about now is unfolding as we speak right now. The perpetrators, which is a word I don't believe is too strong, are my colleagues, people with whom I need to correspond in press, who could very well be in attendance today. Hi, if you're here. I find the whole thing really anxiety-making. So it's super heartening for me to be here with these 2 great friends of mine who I've known for years. And to see so many friends and students and colleagues in the audience, it really means the world to be here with you. I can't emphasize that enough. So like this anxiety, my anxiety, is not just because it's disturbing to be immersed in bigotry, particularly bigotry against people like myself, right? So I'm multiracial and multicultural with like Afghan, Muslim, Ukrainian, Jewish, Portuguese, Catholic, Yankee, colonizer lineage, very mixed bag. My mom calls it the combo platter. I'd also tend to characterize myself as queer and gender nonconforming. Much of the material I will be reviewing today is decidedly and often avowedly bigoted against Muslims, people of color, and queer people, particularly people whose queerness falls along a gendered axis. Much of what I review is also latently anti-Semitic, and most disturbingly so, because many of the people propagating anti-Semitic dog whistles are either Jewish or pretending to be friends of the Jews. So what you're going to see today is horrendous and is probably going to ruin your day. And so I'm not much of a believer in a trigger warning, but let that be one if that's useful. So I'm afraid of all this bigotry, but I'm also afraid of litigiousness and of the vast resources and social power of the people that I'm here to talk about today and their supporters. I'm like a random psych professor in the middle of nowhere, living paycheck to paycheck. I am not a big deal. The only reason I feel at all safe being here with you today and sharing what I'm finding in my research is because I am a member of a union. I'm a union member and organizer of the Massachusetts State College Association, which is part of the National Education Association, the largest labor union in the United States of America. I am one of some 3 million proud members of my union, and the NEA provides for my legal defense in situations that may arise in connection with my lawful exercise of my academic freedom, including the research I do that is part of my job as a professor of clinical psychology and clinical social work. So what that means is that if you mess with me, you're messing with 3 million other educators who are just trying to do our jobs and serve democracy without being harassed. So leave me alone. So part of my talk today is going to be a review of how American fascists have been targeting educators and how they're mobilizing the playbook they ran on educators to target psychotherapists. And I'm here today because nothing fights fascism like a union. And as a union organizer, I feel a special responsibility to address these issues head on. So what I'm presenting to you here, with apologies at considerable length, for reasons I think will become apparent, is the outline of a book that I'm writing right now. Its working title is Bound to Lose, from the song, How Psychoanalysts Became Useful Idiots for Fascism, and it's under contract with Routledge, tentatively scheduled for release in early 2025. I bet they will make the title less rad in the end for SEO optimization. But the problem is that by 2025, we may be living under a frankly fascist regime again. And relatedly, that many of the people and organizations I need to tell you about are building power and war chests incredibly quickly and largely off the radar of basically all psychoanalysts and psychotherapists. So I need you all to know the stuff I am finding out so we can organize to do something about it. We cannot wait for the book. We can't wait for anything. We've got to get on this shit now. Because I'm sharing a very early version of my work, what I'm presenting to you is kind of drafty and a work in progress. I don't want and can't afford to do the psychoanalytic thing of like only showing perfectly polished work that makes me look super brilliant. You're signing up to be subjected to what will at times be a narrative that's like not totally linear and like way more data than you may feel you require, because I'm still trying to like pour all this out of my head, and also because I want you to have the information that I have. So I beg your indulgence. Please don't leave in the first 30 minutes because you're bored of me talking about Freud. I'm going to get to like real blockbuster crazy shit in a little bit. So it's worth the wait if you came for me to spill the tea. So this book is divided into 3 general sections: intellectual history, current problems, and solutions. And actually, this is where, if we could start the slides again, that would be great, please. There we go. And I'm going to do this thing that I think is really probably loathsome, but it's the only way that we could figure out to do it, which is that when I need a new slide, I'm going to say next, and I'm sorry if that is douchey. Intellectual history, current problems, and solutions. I'm going to try to sketch these 3 areas like roughly equally, and they overlap to a great extent. And I'm also going to address them. I'm hoping to be able to address some questions in the chat at transition points between these sections, but it kind of depends on how quickly we get through this. So our problem is that fascists are making psychoanalysis into a beachhead in academia and medicine, one from which they can prosecute their campaigns against minorities in American society. Fascist propagandists have been assiduously targeting psychoanalysis, and some of the preeminent useful idiots for fascist propagandists on the American national stage are psychoanalysts, whose professional credentials are being used to legitimate fascist disinformation, administrative rules, and legislation being driven by fascist governors and attorneys general across the country. How did we get here? This is where we need to be good students of our intellectual history. We got here in part because psychoanalysis as a profession was uniquely vulnerable to this for a host of reasons. Because you see, psychoanalysis has always had a problem with authoritarianism from its inception. Our profession has been strikingly ambivalent in its relationship to authoritarianism. And to understand our current issues with fascism, we need to understand our longstanding issues with authoritarianism. So I'm here to offer kind of genetic interpretation. But I got to define terms. So next slide, please. All fascism is authoritarian, but not all authoritarianism is fascist. It's like a rectangle square thing. I'm using authoritarianism in a relatively more encompassing sense, that of a politics, a way of engaging in shared public life that prizes and demands obedience in various forms, that experiences genuine debate and dissent as threatening to a preferred established order, an order generally overseen by charismatic leaders invested in tradition. In the psychological literature, scholars of authoritarianism commonly argue for an understanding of it as, I'm going to quote this Osborne et al. Study that I linked, the combined tendency to obey authorities, authoritarian submission, punish rule breakers, authoritarian aggression, and conform to tradition, traditionalism. and obeying high status leaders from advantaged groups with the power to punish marginalized groups who threaten the unanimity of in-group values. So the polities in which authoritarianism can take hold are not just nations or electorates. Any community can fall prey to this, including a professional community like psychoanalysis. And we do next, please. I'm using the concept of fascism in a highly specific sense, one that originates with people who like make their careers studying fascism, which is not what I've done to date. I'm not just calling right-wing things I don't like fascism, and people I disagree with fascists. That's not my move. So fascism is a reactionary form of authoritarianism, one in which the power of the state to exert control over the lives of minorities is seen as a crucial and at times final, i.e. genocidal, solution to a set of largely fantasied social problems. These problems include the decline of tradition, particularly traditional ideas about morality and social roles like gender. It tends to see society as being corrupted by the inferior minds, morals, and even bodies and genetics of minorities, and it is terrified of the minority becoming the majority. It fears intellectuals, whom it often fashions as Jews, Marxists, and white Jesus forbid, the dreaded Jewish Marxist, whom it sees as trying to ensorcel people into believing dangerous ideas that will degrade social cohesion. And it seeks to use the exercise of state power mobilized through the state's law enforcers and licensed professionals like doctors and shrinks as a way to reinstate normal and traditional majoritarian values and to keep minorities in check. Fascist leaders and texts are often actively solicit experiences of rage and disgust and hate in relation to minorities and their supporters, and they often see cruelty as a vital way to teach punitive moral lessons. Hence Serwer's contention that in fascist politics, the cruelty is the point. Next, please. I also wanted to find the concept of the useful idiot, since not everyone may know that it's not like an insult, it's a technically specific term. Merriam-Webster has it that a useful idiot is a naive or credulous person who can be manipulated or exploited to advance a cause or a political agenda. Wikipedia, which is not always reliable, but this passage is so well written, I got to give props to whoever wrote it. A useful idiot is a person perceived as propagandizing for a cause, particularly a cause originating from a devious, ruthless source, without fully comprehending the cause's goals, and who are cynically being used by that cause's leaders. In our early psychoanalytic history, psychoanalytic leaders were confronted by a fascist politics that was avowedly hostile to them. We can do next now, actually. As leftist intellectuals, as Jews, and as people who were asking provocative questions about sexuality and its role in psychic and social life, Nazi sympathizers took over the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute. They pushed out Jews, particularly Jews accused of communism, who mainly fled to America, as you can see from this bulletin they received from the collection of the Freud Museum. Next, the Institute wound up under the direction of Hermann Göring's cousin, Matthias Göring, who turned it into a conversion therapy clinic with referrals from the Hitler Jugend. Psychoanalysts today sometimes imagine that the early development of psychoanalysis as a countercultural movement opposed by fascists, Nazis, who burned Freud's books. I can't attest to whether these books are Freud's, but that's misleading, that way of seeing it. Psychoanalysis was not fascist, but nor was it affirmatively anti-fascist, in part because it was affirmatively authoritarian. An anti-fascist psychoanalysis would have been inimical to the interests of the authoritarian leaders of the early psychoanalytic movement, chiefly Freud. And moreover, fascist efforts to co-opt psychoanalysis through reactionary ends has been a pattern from Berlin through Latin America. You can read Nancy Hollander on that, and regularly throughout the history of post-war United States. So we see in the figure of Freud, and you do the next slide, please. I couldn't find a figure of actual Freud shirtless, so this is the guy who plays Freud on the Netflix show, because I just thought it was more fun to look at for a while, if you have to listen to me talk. So we see in real Freud, someone who had a dispositional authoritarian tendency that was amplified as his actual authority in the world increased. He went to considerable lengths to be the only person permitted to dictate the bounds of acceptable theory and practice of his nascent science, psychoanalysis. While he collaborated with others, he did so like in the spirit of a professor running the lab that collaborates with postdocs. Like they might value their input, but ultimately he's running the show. When his collaborators came to markedly different conclusions than Freud did, they were out. Otto Gross was out, Alfred Adler was out, Carl Jung was out, Sandor Ferenczi was eventually and especially out because he was rad. Freud assembled a secret committee at the urging of his soi-disant Shabbos goy, Ernest Jones, that's what Jones called himself, in part as a strategy to consolidate his hold on the intellectual and institutional life of psychoanalysis with an eye towards completely turfing out Jung. That was the proximate goal. Surrounding himself with loyalists whom he knew would not publicly defy him, next, and would be loyal to his vision for the discipline. Freud gave each of the members of this secret committee a signet ring with a Greek intaglio on it, and they all swore they would not publicly challenge any major precept of psychoanalysis without consulting the committee, that is Freud first, next, if you want to see the rings. Like, doesn't that sound like some absolute dictatorial cult leadership to you? Blows my mind. So we can hold on this ring slide for a while just because they're pretty. Freud feared what he called a wild psychoanalysis, that is, one that was not tamed by or obedient to him personally and consistent with his own opinions. Freud did not see psychoanalysis as a diverse discipline that would necessarily undergo paradigm shifts and need to legitimate and contain and work through major disagreements on matters of consequence. He saw it as a singular via regia. The fact that key aspects of what would have been considered wild psychoanalysis would also not pass ethical muster today, like all the sex with patients or using techniques in a way that's like unmoored from their ontological and epistemological anchors, like that should not divert our attention from the fact that Freud felt unilaterally entitled to dictate the terms of what was and was not psychoanalysis. He says in Wild Psychoanalysis that psychoanalysis, quote, cannot yet be learned from books, and like other medical techniques, it is to be learned from those who are already proficient in it, end quote. This is a kind of sleight of hand that ultimately arrogates all intellectual authority back to Freud himself. He acts as if he regrets this, quote, neither I myself nor my friends and coworkers find it agreeable to claim a monopoly in this way in the use of a medical technique. But in the face of the dangers to patients and to the cause of psychoanalysis that are inherent in the practice that is to be foreseen of a wild psychoanalysis, we had no other choice, end quote. Bullshit. Bullshit, Sigma. I think you find it plenty agreeable to be the one who makes all the choices. So when Freud died, and I actually think we can go back to me for a minute, and then I'll tell you when we can go back to slide number 12, please, Jasmine. When Freud died, we had what business dweebs would call a founder effect on our hands. The profession fell into internecine intellectual infighting, of which the London's controversial discussions were just the most major front. What we see in the aftermath of Freud's death is a scrum, a jostling of people all trying to stake claim to the charismatic intellectual authority and to the right to lead the church. That we would wind up with a sectarian arrangement with ego psychologists and Kleinians and the middle group and Jung and Lacan and others is wholly unsurprising. But what's sort of surprising, at least in principle, is what we don't see. We don't see, notwithstanding Bowlby, much of an effort to empirically establish which aspects of psychoanalytic theory are true or not. We don't see a wide-ranging review of interdisciplinary evidence of the sort Freud at least sometimes found interesting when it suited him. What we see is a persistent squabbling over case reports that would not even count as research today, squabbling over supervisees, literally time in the building. They couldn't be in the building at the same time at the British Institute. We see the Freudian tendency to value evidence that confirms one's hypothesis and to totally ignore evidence that challenges it. What we see, in other words, is an effort by the successors of Freud to lead psychoanalysis in part by acting in accord with the worst tendencies of Freud's own personality. The sense of entitlement to dictate truth and morals unilaterally, the paranoia about legitimacy crises that leads one to surround oneself with intellectual acolytes, the sense that an institution is basically just a vessel for one person to control a bunch of other people rather than an opportunity for genuine democratic process. The interjection and replication of these tendencies actually came to define psychoanalytic culture by the mid-20th century, because culture is just the intergenerational transmission of knowledge and practices. So once the Freudian way became established, the established culture, it could replicate generation to generation in a kind of naturalized fashion, being seen as essential to the nature and demands of psychoanalysis itself, rather than as reflecting the characterological failings of some dude. This, we came to think, is psychoanalysis inherently. And that, I think, is very much what Freud would have wanted, for everyone's ego to live in the shadow of him as an object. And crucially for our purposes, delimiting the bounds of what is and is not psychoanalysis became a key power move, maybe the key power move within the profession. I have to hydrate. It could have been otherwise. There were other currents, free clinics, free love, but these did not really survive into the diaspora. The hostile, highly conditional welcome of psychoanalysis, was pari passu Judaism, the conditional welcome in England and especially in the United States did not leave room for such things, even as a somewhat kind of like groovier and sexier, but still like very misogynistic and racist and homophobic psychoanalysis did persist in some parts of Latin America. In the English-speaking world, though, the psychoanalytic diaspora had to adjust itself to an authoritarian, doctrinaire, decidedly white cultural context. And in such a context, Freud's more authoritarian ways of being were actually consonant with cultural norms, so that flourished while other aspects of Freudian character fell by the wayside. I think of this as like, there can only be one Highlander. A setup where charismatic intellectual authority trumps laterally organized shared governance, it's inimical to building durable institutions. And as a result, after the death of Freud, we saw like a ramifying schismatic process in which institutes cleaved off of other institutes based on schisms that arose out of the competitions for intellectual authority. And it must be noted, all conflicts of intellectual authority in psychoanalysis are always already conflicts about money, because a psychoanalyst's intellectual authority is paid for by the hour. During World War II, the New York Psychoanalytic declined to sponsor a second round of Jewish refugee analysts because, by their own accounts in writing, they did not want to compete for patients with them because they thought that the Jewish analysts from Europe were better at their jobs and they would crowd them out, which is what happened. US physicians worked for decades to exercise a monopoly over psychoanalysis until they were busted for restraint of trade. Competition for intellectual acolytes is also competition for paying analysans and supervisees. And following the arrival of managed care, these acolytes were the majority of analytic patients. Most analysans are clinicians, and the only way for an analyst to make money by doing what they saw as psychoanalysis, the activity that was core to their identity and to their sense of authority in the world. Further compounding this problem was the fact that psychoanalysts were mainly refusing to debate philosophical propositions with reference to a shared body of trustworthy evidence that could reasonably confirm or disconfirm them. What a novel concept. The debates about the relative merits of different schools of psychoanalytic thought were mainly theological in nature, ultimately reducing to articles of faith about human nature and the nature of the unobservable in psychic life. This recognition of the religious qualities of psychoanalytic culture and logic is like not at all original or new, but it bears repeating constantly, in part because we seem to relentlessly refuse to outgrow it. Psychoanalytic stalwarts as traditionalists like Otto Kernberg and Nancy McWilliams, they've been writing about this problem for decades. Kernberg has written many papers about it. He's described psychoanalytic institutes as totalitarian seminaries that are beset by authoritarianism and arbitrariness, and which refuse to engage with evidence and systematically kill the creativity of candidates. Well, McWilliams has noted that American institutes are characterized by a, quote, somewhat cult-like atmosphere, end quote. And like many cults, abuses of power, especially sexual boundary violations, have been rife, as documented by like Muriel Dimon, Katie Gentili, Glenn Gabbard, Andrea Salenza, and others. Psychoanalysts were having a functionally religious argument. We should be quite unsurprised that resolution was not forthcoming and that sectarianism became the order of the day. So a number of different people have written well about the schismatic sectarian history of analytic institutes and the contest between charismatic authorities that drove them. Douglas Kersner, who calls himself a libertarian and with whom I disagree about many things, wrote what I nonetheless think is a fabulous book, Unfree Associations, a history of the American Psychoanalytic Institutes. Douglas's historical work is like invaluable for our profession. It's like really crucial. And it contributed to another major work in this area, which is Kate Schechter's Illusions of a Future from 2014. Kate uses history and ethnography to chart the evolution of the Chicago psychoanalytic scene, where these schisms and contests and like all the money behind it were very, very evident. You can also look at like Janet Malcolm's Psychoanalysis, an Impossible Profession, T.M. Lerman's Of Two Minds, which is like an amazing book for journalistic and ethnographic accounts of the relationship between like epistemology, culture, political economy, and power in the Psychoanalytic Institute. So there's a literature on this. As all these authors document, these schisms and fights could only go on for so long until the profession ceased to be a profession and fully came apart at the seams. That's obviously not what happened, even as people seem to have their hair on fire today about that possibility right now. So how did the situation stabilize? I would contend that as a profession, we have not remotely appreciated the intellectual and political consequences of the introduction of the concept of theoretical pluralism into our profession. Theoretical pluralism had and has many boosters, chief among them Wallerstein, the erstwhile president of the IPA. And you can readily see how, as head of the IPA, he would have a political incentive to craft a vision of psychoanalysis that could keep many fractious international constituencies under one figurative roof. So I should drink this. The promise of theoretical pluralism that Wallerstein and others offered was basically this. We are all much more simply psychoanalytic than otherwise. Our theoretical disagreements are mainly serving to divide us and to weaken our profession. Can't we all just get along? So proponents would go so far as to characterize this orientation to theory, this desire for what Wallerstein called common ground, as, and here I'm quoting a guy called Berkhofer from 2017. I forgot to make a slide for this, sorry. Quote, essential if we want to create something of value from our differences and to be an intellectually alive discipline, end quote. So that stance has been politically expedient, as I think was Wallerstein's intention probably, but it's deeply intellectually faulty and far more conservative than it first appears. Don't let the word pluralism fool you into thinking this is some lefty proposition. This stance would not pass muster in any other scholarly discipline, and it makes us look ridiculous to normal academics. Normal academics recognize that it is very much our job to disagree relentlessly, to stress test ideas through forceful challenges and see if they actually hold up. It's steel sharpening steel. A formulation that suggests that members of a discipline should focus on common ground, that is, the things on which they already agree with or without good evidence, it runs afoul of the very thing that makes scholars scholars. In psychoanalysis, this has not been seen as a major problem because we are mostly content to pretend to be scholars without actually behaving as scholars must. The result is far from what Berkhofer calls an intellectually alive discipline. Rather, what we have is a discipline that is endlessly retreading and repeating itself, chewing its cud, one that struggles enormously to create new hypotheses and to generate new knowledge, one in which any research that confirms the value of psychoanalysis as is lauded, and any research that disconfirms it or challenges its key psychoanalytic hypotheses is discredited or ignored. And I can give you lots of examples of that, but I don't have time. In psychoanalysis, we see every theoretical phase of our profession not as a period of intellectual history, but as an off-ramp. Every theory you learn at an analytic institute from Freud forward is framed as a legitimate theoretical destination at which you can set up shop. You are absolutely authorized to practice like a 1923 Freudian as if the interceding 100 years of knowledge production never happened. Call it contemporary Freudian if you want, NYU, but the substantive fact is that psychoanalysts don't really treat theory as a set of hypotheses or questions. They treat it as a set of convictions. One area in which this is particularly on display is in the area of peer review. So I'm using peer review to encompass several essential scholarly practices, only one of which is the act of refereeing for journals and book publishers. Peer review is the process by which we adjudicate what is and is not intellectually legitimate. And for those of you who are already bored with this, please just wait for the zany shit I'm going to tell you about in a few minutes. Please indulge me. This is going somewhere. So I would contend that our standards of peer review have had to slacken considerably in order to accommodate people's perceived rights to make revanchist 19th century arguments, if that is what they wish to do. Psychoanalytic journals, especially more marginal ones, do not reliably function as arbiters of whether a person's scholarship is legitimate in light of ongoing research. They don't actually see it as their job to adjudicate whether the premises a person is articulating in a book or an article are true or not. This extends to the fact that psychoanalytic peer reviewers do not routinely verify the veracity or quality of the citations authors use to support their claims, such that psychoanalytic authors can flagrantly pretend that things are facts, which are not facts, without ever getting caught. The result is that many refereed articles are basically built on a foundation of sand and nobody seems to give a shit. The situation is as or more dire in book publishing. Psychoanalytic book publishers like Routledge no longer referee whole manuscripts, just proposals. And the result is that if you put together a reasonable sounding short proposal and then write an off the wall, insane and baseless book, it will still be published and you will still be able to cite it as a factual and peer reviewed scholarly source. So you should, and take note, by the way, if you look at your bookshelf, how rarely psychoanalytic books are published by university presses, which actually engage in peer review of whole manuscripts. Parenthetically, I'm proud to say that Routledge acceded to my request to have the entire manuscript of Bound to Lose blind refereed, because I want to be as strong and reliable as possible. And I would encourage other authors in the room to make that same request if you're writing books. So by the same token, right, censorship in psychoanalytic venues, both journals and institutions, is on the rise, even as normal processes of refereeing are waning. In a forthcoming article in Psychoanalysis, Culture, and Society, I describe a series of 3 cases in which psychoanalytic institutions rescinded or otherwise scuppered controversial speakers and writers whose work was critical of psychoanalysis itself. You can see that piece in a few months for more details. I'll give you the little thumbnail now. So one case is that of Lara Shihab being disinvited from APSA for being a controversial speaker. I'm going to talk more about Lara's travails later, and probably a lot of you have been following that anyway and know about it. One that you may not know about is the International Journal of Psychoanalysis censoring a paper by Sakatapoulou and Pellegrini, hi, Anna Navi, to which they had actually given an award after Avi and Anne refused to redact the following from their acknowledgements. They say, quote, "This project insists on welcoming queer subjects, patients as well as candidates and analysts, who have too often been treated as problems for psychoanalysts, rather than as offering opportunities from which to think our metapsychology anew. Wresting such space is not easy or pleasant, but it is necessary and critical to psychoanalysis' survival. May future generations of queer analysts and patients, queer and trans analysts and patients never encounter what many of us who are queer identified have had to. That, more than anything, is the vision of our work in this paper." So that was the thing that seems to have made the journal not want to publish this anymore. Cool. And the last case that I get into is my experience at a Boston institute, in which the institute rescinded an invitation they'd given me to present my work on whiteness in analytic institutes, when I wouldn't promise not to allude to my experiences of racism in that institute. And after going like 9 rounds about this in a meeting where we were debating this, one of the co-chairs of the program committee said to me, quote, "You don't understand. We would never allow someone to give a paper that was critical of the work of any institute member." And she said this like she was clearing everything up, and like that made it all better. So taken together, I interpret these stories and issues as showing us a psychoanalysis that is far more concerned with whether it looks respectable than with protecting academic freedom or actually being correct. I see these as emerging in large measure from the compromise formation of theoretical pluralism and the way it papered over conflicts produced by psychoanalysis' longstanding authoritarian tendencies. That is, like, theoretical pluralism makes dissent and disconfirmation problematic activities because it's about disagreeing. Theoretical pluralism, I contend, it attempts to fix psychoanalysis in a Groundhog Day repetition, wherein we pretend that we're doing normal science in order to forestall paradigm shifts that would disempower some currently empowered psychoanalysts who exert considerable influence. What feels to us maybe like big shifts, like the social turn or an interest in neuroscience, these are like actually relatively minor compared to the evolution that other professions have undergone, and they do little to disrupt the underlying axiomatic and axiological assumptions of psychoanalysis, in part because like lots of us just refuse to contend with the ways in which social theory and neuroscience illustrate that we are mistaken in many foundational assumptions about the nature of the self, of transference, of psychopathology, and of cure. We just don't want to hear that we're wrong. So we could then, if we could resume the slides, please, Jasmine. So we see an earlier illustration of this ongoing issue in the enormous difficulties psychoanalysis has had in abandoning a fantasy that being gay is a mental disorder or a neurosis. I would encourage the interested listeners to go check out this old episode of the radio show This American Life. The episode is entitled 81 Words, and it's a great oral history of how homosexuality was removed from the DSM. The history, in brief, is that there needed to be a critical mass of necessarily closeted gay analysts and their allies working both within and without APA and APSA, both APAs and APSA, in order to dislodge an existing cohort of conversion therapists who were standing athwart the institution, protecting their right to practice an unethical intervention from which they made enormous money. Don't make fun of me for having multiple beverages. The stakes for these conversion therapists were high. If they were proven wrong about homosexuality being a malady, their credibility would evaporate. The ethical, legal, and intellectual justifications for their life's work and ongoing clinical practice would be taken away. We should be unsurprised, therefore, that these conversion therapists have fought tooth and nail to be allowed to continue practicing conversion therapy on gay patients. They did not want to lose their money or their captive population of patients. Next, please. I want to tell you briefly about one of these figures from our history whose example is instructive to us in the present. His name was Charles Socarides. He was a psychiatrist and an analyst, and a fancy one at that, practicing from the 1950s through the 1990s. He was educated at Harvard and Columbia University Psychoanalytic, and he was a distinguished member of APSA, IPA, and the other major psychoanalytic organizations of the day. He was also a public intellectual, appearing on many of the major nightly news programs at the time. He won many distinguished psychoanalytic awards and lectured at all of our most august institutions, and was generally the guy, really. Socarides was also a fire-breathing homophobe, conversion therapist, and propagandist. He devoted his career to the notion that being gay was a neurotic adaptation set off by a bad mother, and that he was fairly reliably in a position to cure it. He said he worked with over 1,000 homosexuals, and he had a roughly 33% cure rate. He would not have described what he was practicing as conversion therapy, because he understood it not as a conversion, but as a reversion back to putatively normal development following a pathological fixation. That was, of course, a stupid rationalization by any reasonable standard, and one that also required like a gender essentialist assumption about who was supposed to want to fuck whom. Sorry, I'm going to say fuck a lot today, pardon me. My mom would be really mad. Socarides used his standing in the profession, his high psychoanalytic offices and publication record, and his appearances on national television to propagate a vision of homosexuality as perversion that made him an affluent and influential man. This self-serving effort had numerous casualties, from his patients to his relationship with his own son, Richard, a gay man who went on to serve as the liaison on gay and lesbian issues for Bill Clinton in the 90s. Next, please. In the 1990s, Socarides published a pair of books with Vomik Volkan called The Homosexualities. Don't forget that when Volkan is lifted up in our field as a paragon of human rights and conflict resolution, that dude is a rank homophobe who tried to get the APA to revote to rescind its removal of homosexuality from the DSM. He did that in 1974. Can you, next slide, please, actually? Because what you'll see is the publication in the New York Times of a story about the effort to get that revoted on, that names all of the people who asked the APA to please let them do conversion therapy again. It's Vomik Volkan and Socarides and a few others. I have slides out of order. Let me see if I can rearrange these. All right, I'm fixing something on the fly. I did these slides at 4:30 in the morning yesterday, so it's a little bit of a struggle. Okay. So no, they were in the first place. My bad. Oh my God, can you tell that I have not been sleeping properly? So next slide, please. As late as 1995, decades after homosexuality was removed from the DSM-5, Socarides published a book entitled "Homosexuality: A Freedom Too Far." When it became untenable to publish overtly homophobic books in psychoanalysis, Socarides turned his energies to what he saw as a reasonably cognate issue. Next. Pedophilia. Great. Moreover, once regarding homosexuality as a mental disorder was made relatively untenable in mainstream professional organizations, particularly after APSA prohibited homophobic discrimination in admissions in 1991, which, by the way, was like 15 years after homosexuality was delisted. So like, what the fuck took them so long? So after all this, Socarides started a new organization, Next, please, the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, or NARTH. This is their sad poster at some conference. By 2014, NARTH's brand had become too compromised by having homosexuality in the name. So they rebranded, next slide please, as the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity. They continue to operate under this name today. Pay attention to the way groups like the ones we're talking about today give themselves anodyne sounding names. It's something propagandists like to do to smuggle in bullshit and make it sound reasonable. So they're called this other acronym. I'm going to keep calling them NARTH today because it is a douchey sounding acronym that is befitting of their nonsense, like NARTH. Narth, 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 narth. It's just fun to say. It sounds like a mastiff sneezing. So NARTH's purpose is the advancement of conversion therapy as a legitimate clinical practice. They have tried to improve the branding of the practice, including by rechristening it as reparative therapy. They also now advertise themselves as, quote, as you see on this slide, informed by Judeo-Christian values and natural law. And they routinely make common cause with other right-wing religious organizations, including the Mormon Church and the anti-gay hate group, the Family Research Council, with whom they share an interest in legitimating conversion therapy. This is both a political and a financial matter. It is now widely illegal to offer, charge for, or seek insurance reimbursement for conversion therapy, which makes it difficult for people who do this to earn a living. Another key purpose of NARTH is the propagation of what the Southern Poverty Law Center has called, quote, anti-gay junk science, end quote, in which conversion therapy proponents produce slipshod nonsense research and lie with statistics in an effort to persuade audiences that do not have the requisite background knowledge or critical faculties to know that they are being bullshitted. In the beginning, one of NARTH's co-founders, this guy Kaufman, he wrote an article entitled "In Defense of the Need for Honest Dialogue." This is not the last time today that you're going to hear exhortations to honest dialogue and reasonable debate from people who are saying totally off the wall insane things. Because when you're debating them, they're winning. In the article, Kaufman argues that he and Socarides needed to form NARTH because the mainstream medical and psychological organizations, quote, had totally stifled the scientific inquiry that would be necessary to stimulate a discussion, end quote, that is about homosexuality. Of course, like that's precisely what a professional organization is supposed to do, work against the propagation of junk science that undermines the ethical standards and credibility of the profession. That's peer review. Debate is not a neutral proposition, and not all debate is ethical. When you're debating the civil rights of a particular group, whoever is opposed to that group having civil rights is already winning. And public debates about the merits of civil rights have never really been a decisive factor in winning those rights, according to people who study civil rights history. Scholarly inquiry has a role to play in debunking bullshit, but this debunking mainly serves to help create an environment in which activists can force organizations and governments to stop messing with minorities based on lies. Next slide, please. Oh, I love this. Just a fun note for you. NARTH's former scientific advisor was a psychologist and minister named George Reckers. Reckers was a major propagandist pushing against gay rights in the United States, who, in addition to working for NARTH, served on the board of the Family Research Council. Reckers also infamously, allegedly, you can't sue me, allegedly, got busted for hiring a rent boy, seen on the left, for a 2-week sex romp in Europe. What a pair of absolute snacks. I, for the record, have no problem with anybody hiring sex workers. I think that sex workers do important jobs, but it's kind of methinks that doth protest too much. So I'm just going to leave this slide up for a while because it's funny. The story of Socarides and of NARTH is not just a historical curiosity; it's an object lesson and a blueprint for action. For those of us who are advocates of civil rights for queer people, we see in the case of Socarides and NARTH a model for how to root bigotry out of our profession and force it to the margins, where it may still exert some influence, but the influence is attenuated. It's weaker than it would otherwise be. But bigot's going to bigot, but you can try to minimize it. But it's also a model for how bigots can insert fascist and theocratic propaganda into the academic discourse, and at least often get away with it, particularly if they do so by giving credence to the prejudices of people who would otherwise prefer not to see themselves as prejudiced. And I think we can go back to me, if that's okay, Jasmine, and then I'll tell you when to come back to slide 21. here, we begin to get to our present difficulties. So actually, you know what? Let's do this. Let's take a very brief break and just have a little stretch. Let's take 1 minute to digest as I start to turn the corner into some of our newer stuff. So I'm going to just step outside and get a little air on my face and then come back. I'll be see you in 1 moment. Enjoy your break. Okay, we're back with a third beverage because it's that sort of day. So welcome back. As I've begun to establish, the authoritarian tendencies of our profession have weakened us intellectually in various ways. Psychoanalysis is a monocultural activity in many respects. It recruits a demographically homogenous group of people and then invites them into many, many years of training in monodisciplinary institutions, psychoanalytic institutes, often headquartered in the same segregated areas in which psychoanalysts themselves wind up living. The demographic specifics matter here a lot. Psychoanalysis is predominantly a profession of the white, often Ashkenazi Jewish, cisgender, heterosexual, affluent, political center left or center right. By the way, this is like both my personal impression and it's also substantiated by APS's own data, like demographic data about who psychoanalysts are. Psychoanalysis tends to confine itself to enclaves that also like fit this description and like where people like this want to live. By the way, I come from these people. These are the communities I used to live in, I should note, before I moved to the sticks. So this segregation, together with the restrictive and socially isolating nature of clinical practice, it does much to insulate psychoanalysts from the experiences of people who are not like themselves. People who come from communities that have traditionally experienced hostility from psychoanalysis, queer people, people of color, poor people, people with more radical politics, do not exactly flock to psychoanalytic institutions or the communities that house them. And indeed, we're often actively rebuffed in explicit and implicit ways. There is so much to be said about this. It's beyond the scope for me to get into details here. I want you to watch out for an article that my research team, which Tara's on, my research team, we did a study that's currently under review at IJAPS of BIPOC experiences of discrimination in psychoanalytic professional organizations, which our findings mainly confirm and then expand upon in various ways the findings of the Holmes Commission. If you want that slide deck, just email me and I'll give it to you. I'm happy to share it. It's equally a fire hose of data, just like today. So our monocultural discipline then navigates the theological nature of psychoanalytic disputes by basically ignoring, sanitizing, or deferring them in various ways under the supposedly virtuous program of theoretical pluralism. We do not encounter or engage in research that risks challenging our foundational theoretical assumptions. And when we encounter such research, challenging stuff, we have ample modes of motivated reasoning that allow us to ignore it or to discount its findings. Psychoanalysts are not, as a rule, involved in research, particularly psychoanalysts. Skipped it. So we're not generally involved in research, but I'd hazard that almost all of us like feel like we're supposed to be knowledgeable about research, particularly those of us with doctoral training. So the result is that we are extremely easy to trick because we don't know when we're being bullshitted, but we have a strong incentive to pretend like we know what we're talking about. It's like a Dunning-Kruger nightmare scenario. By the way, I'm not unique in this assumption, in this conclusion. Douglas Kersner says basically the same thing about the psychoanalysts he interviewed in Unfree Associations, hundreds of them. Taken together, we have a psychoanalytic culture that is made increasingly naive, credulous, and intellectually immunocompromised. Remember that definition of useful idiot where they talked about naivety and credulity? So naive, credulous, intellectually immunocompromised, one in which people are routinely given cultural permission to like believe whatever they want without regard for how true it is, and in which segregation creates numerous opportunities for confirmations of one's prejudices, while insulating one from the numerous experiences with minoritized people that could risk disconfirming those prejudices, especially because the pervasive hostility of psychoanalysis towards unassimilationist minorities means it tends to attract assimilationist and acquiescent minorities who are disinclined to challenge majoritarian prejudices in a forceful or self-affirming fashion. Those queer people, people of color, or poor people who wind up in psychoanalysis and wind up ascending are usually of the respectable, genteel variety. Those of us who are prouder and less accommodating of bigotry tend to get like demolished by the institutional mechanisms of psychoanalysis, as my research and that of the Holmes Commission makes clear. So this is a fertile environment for fascist exploitation. That might seem strange to say. Psychoanalysis is a profession forged by leftist Jews, one that is enormously invested in what it sees as a progressive, cosmopolitan, kind of culturally Jewish identity. We're the ones in the New Yorker cartoons. Surely this would not be a welcoming place for the Charlottesville Jews will not replace us crowd to make inroads, right? You'd like to think. Moreover, isn't this a profession that has been increasingly embracing of queer people, in which queerphobic bigotry would not be welcomed? To think this is to overestimate psychoanalysis and to underestimate fascists. Psychoanalysis is a profession that, as we've established, was absolutely content with a baseline state of horrible bigotry against minorities for virtually all of its existence. Queer people, people of color, were systematically excluded and degraded by the profession, which we still are in many ways. People who joined this profession in the 70s and 80s, as many of our current eminence grise did, were affirmatively signing up for a profession that had essentially no Black people in it, in which gay people were formally disallowed from training, in which trans people were understood purely as pure perverts and reprobates who wouldn't get within a mile of an institute unless they were going to the clinic to get converted. This was and remains a genteel, upper-class, exclusionary occupation, one that centrally focuses on the identification of pathology and its correction back to a state of presumed normality. In particular, it's a discipline, the central contention of which has been that stable cisgender identification is a predicate of psychological normalcy. This is one of the few things with which basically every major psychoanalytic school of thought has agreed. The Jungians imagine human nature as inherently cisgender binary, viz. Like animus and anima. The Oedipus complex presupposes the same thing. British object relations, like you can read Winnicott in a way that sees mothering as a non-gendered function, but like obviously in reality, it presupposed stable maternal and paternal interjects that constituted gender identity in a fairly predictable fashion. Like Winnicott's radio show on the BBC was literally called The Ordinary, i.e. Normal, Loving Mother and Her Baby, right? Like, come on. Cisgender identification has been absolutely integral to psychoanalytic theoretical assumptions about who is a legitimate, mature psychoanalytic subject. Consequently, a formidable defensive identification with cisness should not be surprising in psychoanalysis. And now, Jasmine, we can go to slide 21, please. So now, I'm so stupid. We're entering the phase of this presentation I have been referring to in my midnight complaints to my wife as my Pepe Sylvia breakdown. If you are not familiar with this reference to Pepe Sylvia, you can Google it. It's from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. You should watch the video of this scene when my talk is over because it's very funny. One of the extremely unenviable things about being a scholar of propaganda and disinformation is that it is produced and distributed by interlocking networks of propagandists, institutions, and venues like captive journals, blogs, and book publishers. So being able to see the interconnections of all of these, it can give you a map of the discourse that, when viewed from above, makes really plain the ideological work that is happening. So my goal today is to offer an intellectual genealogy that lays bare the allied political interests at work in this discourse, namely that people who might masquerade as current or former liberals are working in common cause with the most prominent fascist propagandists in America and the often Christian white nationalist institutions and venues that serve them. But my problem is that you can look like an absolute insane person, imputing guilt by association and drawing connections on your wall in red yarn, Pepe Sylvia. It's like death by data. It can be just too much. I found that there's no way to totally avoid this impression, because when you're delving into the world of conspiracy theorists and propagandists, you wind up like tarred by it unavoidably. And frankly, it makes me feel a bit nuts. I feel a little nuts now. I've taken pains here to include like numerous citations and hyperlinks and screenshots that include, the links to websites. So this should allow you to run down all of the claims I'm making yourself if you're interested. All you need is Google for the most part. And I'm highly confident that if you review the material I have reviewed, you will arrive at the same general impressions that I have, which I hope is what happens today. So next, please. 22. I trust we are all familiar with Ron DeSantis, he of the alleged Cuban heels and the failing presidential campaign. This picture is actually from Trump's Truth Social page, but it's funny, so I'm using it anyway. Ron DeSantis is a fascist, according to the uncontroversial definition of the term I offered above. He's a state executive seeking to arrogate maximum power to himself, both by way of and in service of prosecuting a discriminatory campaign against minorities and leftist intellectuals that consolidates majoritarian demographic power in the state. His communication style mainly tries to invite his audiences into rage and disgust and hate directed at minorities and their advocates. Next, please. He is trying to assert control over the state's public university system as a way to persecute leftist academics, undermine unions, roll back civil rights protections and basic considerations like gender-neutral bathrooms for queer people and people of color in the university systems. Florida is the axis of a nationwide anti-woke political agenda that is fascist in its methods and purposes. And this agenda is DeSantis's whole selling point as a presidential candidate, trying to outflank Donald Trump from the right, particularly on queer issues. DeSantis is advancing a legislative and administrative agenda that targets the rights of queer people on numerous fronts. He's using Florida's attorney general to propagate laws that restrict the civil rights of queer people, in part by disrupting their access to medically necessary care. He has stacked the state's board of medicine with partisan propagandists and junk scientists who have now banned gender-affirming care from minors. Banned it. An approach that is likely to catch on quickly across other states because boards of medicine are gubernatorial appointments. So DeSantis has considerable executive authority, but he is also an absolutely uncharismatic boob, no riz, as the kids say, which limits his ability to be a fully successful fascist leader because they tend to need charisma to get broad public support. So consequently, he has to rely more than average on propagandists whose own charisma, rhetorical skill, and apparent credibility exceed his own. So I'd like to introduce you to a few of the people he relies on to this end. Next, please. 24. I love Ron DeSantis' face in this picture. So Viz, one Chris Rufo. Christopher Rufo is arguably the most influential fascist propagandist in the United States. He's a favorite guest on Tucker Carlson's show when he was on Fox. Like a lot of propagandists, Steve Bannon was one of these. Rufo is a failed filmmaker. Rufo is the person who essentially single-handedly came up with the idea of weaponizing the term critical race theory as a way of undermining civil rights struggles and pushing a revanchist racial politics across key domains of American public life. Next, please, for the receipts. As you can see, as he put it on Twitter in 2021, quote, "The goal is for the public to read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans." So if you wonder how propagandists talk with each other when they're being unguarded about their strategies, that's how. Next, please. Just for you, so you know, the next term he's trying to annex is irony of ironies, decolonization, and he's using like public outcry over Gaza and the statements of groups like Section 9 to that end. I have every confidence he will be completely successful at this, unfortunately, because he's excellent at his horrible, immoral job. If you look at this tweet, you'll see it has 1 million views. So he's doing his job right, unfortunately. let's see here. So to date, sorry, let's see what I'm doing. Here's another whole thing about how he's trying to annex decolonization. He says, in practice, decolonization means Gaza-style violence, by which he means like the Hamas attack. Can we do 27 and then 28, please? So to date, Rufo's chief focus has been prosecuting a fascist propaganda campaign against teachers. He has sown disinformation about critical race theory, a term, recall, that he has totally decodified from its real meaning. He's sown disinformation about this being taught in public elementary schools. He's popularized the notion of education about civil rights as unhinged wokeness and indoctrination and re-education, and has been a major actor in stimulating a moral panic about transgender people and what he calls quote unquote gender ideology in general. This made him enormously popular with Ron DeSantis. I would argue that it's appropriate to see Rufo as DeSantis's de facto propaganda minister. And next slide, please. Politico has called him DeSantis's culture warrior, and here's Rufo describing himself as over the walls. You have academia. DeSantis recently appointed him as a trustee of the public New College of Florida. Next, please, 30. By the way, this is the exact photo op he wanted, and Ron DeSantis would kill to have a picture looking this cute with all these protesters and police officers. By the way, I don't think the protesters should have let him get away with this. That was a strategic mistake. So New College is a public liberal arts college. It's actually a sister school to my own public liberal arts college, the Mass College of Liberal Arts. Their former president, who they just fired, was our graduation speaker this year. So DeSantis and Rufo have set about to raise and chase out New College's faculty and student body. Next, please. And to reimagine the school as a public Hillsdale college, an ultra-conservative private Christian college that, among other things, developed the 1776 Project, the Trump administration's racist retort to the 1619 Project. So as a trustee of the New College, Rufo has begun the process of abolishing the Department of Gender Studies at New College and firing faculty who work on issues of race and gender. Rufo has a number of collaborators, but one he holds in particularly high esteem is one James Lindsay. Next, please. Hey, girl. James Lindsay has a PhD in math, but to call him a scholar is misleading. So far as I have found, he didn't publish anything scholarly after defending his dissertation, and instead he returned to his hometown of Maryville, Tennessee, to start a martial arts dojo and massage parlor. Lindsay has been described, as you can see by the Southern Poverty Law Center, as a leading voice in the conspiracy propaganda movement and one of the top fearmongers of critical race theory. So to give you a flavor of his propaganda style, next please, 33. Here he is describing the rainbow flag as the flag of a hostile enemy. This guy's also taking credit for popularizing the use of OK Groomer as an epithet, one that is like often used as a blood libel, accusing queer people of being pedophiles. Next, please, 34. Here he is arguing with the Auschwitz Memorial about vaccines in a very not insane at all way. That Lindsay launched himself from rural massage therapist and dojo manager to the heights of the right-wing propaganda apparatus is instructive. Like the way he did this is instructive. He got together with two other people, Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian, to undertake this like academic hoax in which they submitted nonsense papers to niche social science journals to see if they could get printed. I'm going to tell you more about that hoax story in a while, but what you need to know for right now is that this is somebody whose whole brand is arguing that critical race theory is a farcical front for, next slide, please, 35. What he sometimes calls cultural Marxism. The book title is Race Marxism. These kind of cultural Marxist takeovers of Western civilization, which, by the way, the Anti-Defamation League says that cultural Marxism is an old anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, just mildly repackaged here. So Rufo has described Lindsay as follows. He says, and I'm quoting from the SPLC, which has pulled this from an interview he gave. James is really the theory expert. James is an encyclopedia of theory, connecting all the dots, laying out the case, creating this giant content to guide all of us in this world. And then I think I come in as a complement to what James is doing, really following his lead with the praxis or the practice, which is translating the theory into the realm of practical politics, and then translating this kind of esoteric knowledge that school moms and school dads can use at school board meetings and hammer their school boards with. Next slide, please. This weird reference to school moms and school dads hammering school boards, it relates to an AstroTurf campaign driven by an organization called Moms for Liberty, with which both Rufo and Lindsay have been heavily involved. Here's Lindsay giving an address at their conference in July. I won't play this video just for time, but he greets them by saying, "Good morning, war moms." Incidentally, next slide, please, 37. The Moms for Liberty has referred to my union, the National Education Association, as the K-12 cartel. Next slide, please. Moms for Liberty has showed up with the Proud Boys to intimidate school boards in North Carolina. Their representatives have tweeted lovely things like you see here, like gender dysphoria is a mental health disorder that is being normalized by predators across the US. California kids are at extreme risk from predatory adults. Now they want to liberate children all over the country. Does a double mastectomy on a preteen sound like progress? That shit got them banned from Twitter, by the way, but don't worry, Dojo James has us covered with the screenshots here. Next slide, please. They have vociferously supported Ron DeSantis and his Don't Say Gay and Stop Woke bills. They routinely accuse teachers and school committee members of being pedophiles and groomers. The latter, an epithet that, if you believe him, was invented by Lindsay. And this is just like scratching the surface of the truly unhinged things that Moms for Liberty do. You should just Google this, and you should go read Paige Williams' profile of the group in the New Yorker. It's very comprehensive. And the New Yorker fact checks the bejesus out of everything. So next slide, please. Moms for Liberty are big fans of another famous propagandist named Abigail Schreier. Here's Schreier promoted on the Moms for Liberty Instagram, giving a talk at Hillsdale College. That's that Christian college, you remember, from a minute ago. The one which Ron DeSantis and Chris Rufo are trying to model the new College of Florida on. Like Moms for Liberty, Rufo, Lindsay, and DeSantis, Abigail Schreier is a transphobic propagandist who peddles junk science and disinformation. She is effective at this in part because she's a gifted writer and because she comes across as very respectable. Like Charles Socarides, she's a Columbia graduate. She has a JD from Yale Law, like I believe Ron DeSantis does. And she worked for the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Next slide, 41. Yikes!
There's number two, there is the social
yeah, no, we don't need to play that. We just need 41. Yeah, we don't need to hear her saying all that. You can go watch it if you want to. So Schreier's first book that you see here, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, has been enormously popular to the great consternation of trans people generally, and trans medical providers and scholars who've reviewed it, including Dr. Jack Turban, who wrote, quote, "The book's central and false premise is that there are massive numbers of transgender youth who were not truly transgender, but rather just confused, and that they are all being rushed into gender-affirming medical interventions and surgeries that they will later regret. As a physician and a researcher who has dedicated my career to taking care of and understanding transgender youth, I recognize the book as bizarre and full of misinformation. I assumed it wouldn't gain much traction. I was wrong." The book's cover that you see here has been compared, as you see, to homophobic Nazi propaganda by an expert on homophobic Nazi propaganda. Next slide. And by the way, this book is published by Regnery Press, which bills itself as offering conservative books for independent thinkers. That's their slogan. Among their bestsellers are books by Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, next please, Ann Coulter, and Donald Trump. Charmant. Next. I was particularly struck by their volume In Defense of Internment, The Case for Racial Profiling in World War II and the War on Terror by Michelle Malkin, which talks about how interning Japanese Americans was a good idea and we should do it to all the Muslims too. Regnery is not a publisher that is known for deviating from their ideological agenda to publish liberal work, nor would it appear that they maintain the highest of editorial standards with respect to whether their authors are lying or advocating for genocide. Whatever Schreier's pretensions, this is who wants to publish and promote her work. Okay. So for those of you who've been wanting us to get to the psychoanalysis, here we are. Schreier's book relies heavily on transphobic psychoanalysts with whom she collaborates extensively. So let me tell you about some of them next. Ooh, here I go. On your right here is Lisa Marchiano. She's a Jungian psychoanalyst. She's probably one of the most prominent psychoanalysts in the world right now by virtue of being a co-host of the very popular podcast, This Jungian Life. I expect many of you listen to it. As you see here, New York Magazine just published a glowing profile of the podcast and its co-hosts. What that profile notably did not mention is that Marchiano is one of the most prominent transphobic authors in psychoanalysis or anywhere currently working. Next. Her book with Sasha Ayad and Stella O'Malley is called When Kids Say They're Trans, A Guide for Parents, that just came out this Halloween. Spooky, boo. You can see, next please. Actually, no, let's stay on this. So let's stay on 46. Because you can see some blurbs here from two prominent transphobes, including our friend Schreier, who describes a kid coming out as trans as an emergency to be survived, which is lovely. This book is published in a weird sort of joint international arrangement by Forum, which is Swift Press's conservative imprint, and by Pitchstone Publishing, another marginal conservative press run by, callback, Vamik Volkan's son, Kurt Volkan. Vamik Volkan has also published multiple books with Pitchstone, which is a nice dad thing to do. Remember Pitchstone Press. We're going to come back to them later. And Schreier, I don't have this, I didn't have room on the slide. Schreier wrote the following about this book on Twitter. She writes, "Buy this book," all caps. "Nobody's logged more hours or given more thought to how parents should handle a sudden trans identification." Okay. Lisa Marchiano is not an incidental figure in the transphobic movement. She is arguably its central theorist. To illustrate the extraordinary centrality of her role in the transphobic movement, I will need to review some concepts in history that may be familiar to some of you, probably particularly the trans people in the room, but which I expect many of you may be new to. So here's what you need to know. Next slide, please. One of the propositions underwriting the moral panic about trans people is the notion that there are far more of them than there should be. This is, of course, like a half step from genocidal. We should get nervous when people start talking about how there are too many minorities, whether they're talking about people of color or autistic people or trans people or Palestinians. Fascists often offer self-serving accounts of why there are suddenly so many new minorities. Anti-vaxxer propaganda about rising rates of autism is a prominent example of this. I think Ben Morso might be in the room. Ben is more of an expert on this than I am. Much of the intellectual action that underpins transphobic fascist campaigns involves trying to account for why there are allegedly so many more trans people than there are allegedly supposed to be. The most popular theory for this hinges on a phenomenon that transphobes call rapid onset gender dysphoria. To be clear, as you can see from this Scientific American review, this is not a thing. It is a made-up concept supported only by junk science evidence that is bullshit. Nonetheless, the specter of rapid onset gender dysphoria has been raised by state attorneys general in Arkansas, Texas, and Florida, and elsewhere as part of their justifications for banning trans-affirming medical care, as well as by state legislators and governors pushing for divisive concepts legislation to ban the teaching of gender ideology and the making of basic non-discriminatory public accommodations for trans people, because they're afraid that even hearing about being trans is going to trans the kids. The general concept is that gender dysphoria in the young can be, indeed usually is, quote unquote, rapid onset in instances when it is animated by what proponents call social contagion. It should not surprise you that the notion of transgender as socially contagious in the way these propagandists describe it is also disinformation propped up by junk science, about which more presently. It might also encourage you to know that this stance has been repudiated by all major health and mental health organizations involved in trans healthcare, including the APA, as well as the World Health Organization and the UN, although, of course, that didn't matter at all to Ron DeSantis. There's a discouraging note I'll sound, which is that one council accreditation organization in England, the UKCP, has fallen for this bullshit, and the transphobes are putting it all over their Twitters. Next. Lisa Marchiano is, it appears, the person who originated the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria in the first place in a 2017 article called Outbreak on Transgender Teens and Psychic Epidemics. As you can see, this paper was published in Psychological Perspectives, a quarterly journal of Jungian thought, that is a psychoanalytic journal. In this paper, Marciano describes ROGD as if it were already a recognized phenomenon, but according to the trans academic Julia Serrano, there's like no real evidence that the term predated Marciano's 2017 use of it, and there's considerable evidence to indicate that she likely invented it herself. Sorry, I'm just going to lost my notes. Sorry, I want to make sure I'm saying this is right. Considerable evidence that she likely invented it herself, and that she may have been advancing the concept in slightly different terms anonymously on transphobic parents' websites, like Fourth Wave Now, under a pseudonymous username before publishing the concept in a psychoanalytic journal. Next, please. After Outbreak, Marciano was apparently instrumental in efforts to advance research on this concept, in part through an infamous 2018 study. You can see the correction to it here, by psychologist Lisa Littman. Marciano is listed as a contributor on the study, if I understand correctly, that sampled parents active on notorious transphobic parent websites to manufacture evidence for the existence of ROGD. These are the same websites on which Marciano, according to Serrano, seems to have pseudonymously originated the concept, and on the comment section of which she was very active under her real name. I have screenshots of this that I forgot to put in, but she's like all over the comment section as herself in 2017. So at least according to Serrano's analysis, it's plausible to infer that what happened is that Marciano anonymously published agitprop, encouraging parents to see their kids' trans identification as rapid onset due to social contagion, and then published a theoretical paper justifying the concept without real evidence, and then was involved in a study in which they sampled these same websites and presumably these same parents to find out if this is how they thought about their child's gender transitions. So in other words, if this is what happened, they were priming the pump. And if that's true, I don't know if that's true. If that were true, I would argue that it would be a flagrant violation of research ethics. This 2018 study, as you can see here, has already been decisively critiqued as having a fatally defective, unreliable, and invalid methodology, and of irresponsibly overstating its claims it really can't make confidently because its methodology sucks so bad. And the journal in which it was published, PLOS ONE, which you should know has a notoriously weaker peer review standard than comparable journals by reputation, they engaged in a post-publication review that resulted in the extensive corrections that you can see listed here. The study is widely recognized to be junk science. Here's something interesting. Next, please. 50. One of the main responses to devastating criticism of this study was authored by Marciano and by another psychoanalyst named Robert D'Angelo, the former president of IARP Australia, the second largest IARP chapter in the world after the USA. By the way, American Psychological and Psychiatric Associations are among numerous mainstream mental health organizations that have demanded the elimination of the use of ROGD for clinical and diagnostic purposes because it is bullshit. And this was hardly the last article on ROGD to require retraction. I'm going to tell you about more of them in a little bit. Of course, none of these damning critiques and corrections mattered in political terms. This situation was still a huge victory for propagandists. Next slide, please. Who get to say that their work was published in scientific journals despite censorious efforts to cancel their brave truth-telling and cancel their authors. It's made into a parable for free speech absolutism and cancel culture, and the rhetorical value of calling ROGD scientific remains intact for all the people who want to use it towards fascist ends, as evidenced by the fact, as you can see here, that this controversy got top billing at Fox News, the Daily Caller, which Tucker Carlson started, the Federalist, the Wall Street Journal. Carlson, what you're looking at here, is Tucker Carlson did a 2-part primetime special on ROGD. Ordinary people, especially but not exclusively conservatives, absolutely believe that ROGD is a thing now. And it would be really difficult to disabuse them of this idea. The horse is out of the barn. This is something you need to understand about propaganda. The only way for you to beat it is by never allowing it to enter the peer-reviewed discourse in the first place. You absolutely must hold that wall. That's why Chris Rufo talks about getting over the wall. In sum, Luisa Marchiano, a famous psychoanalyst, is to all appearances the inventor of the linchpin concept behind all of the transphobic propaganda and legislation currently besieging the United States, being talked about in primetime on Tucker Carlson. And it seems that very few psychoanalysts or fans of this Jungian life know about this, even though this is literally the central strategy that all Republicans are using to try to take back the White House. Marchiano has also been an active and or founding member of a series of notorious groups run by transphobic clinicians that, according to psychoanalyst Jack Drescher, function very much in the mode of Narth. Remember Narth? Narth formed when the mainstream professional associations had become sufficiently unwelcoming to homophobic bigotry, and people who wanted to keep doing homophobic bigotry needed to have a respectable seeming venue for their activities. Plus ça change. In the case of Marchiano and these colleagues, the haven for transphobic clinical bigotry originally took the form of something called the Pediatric and Adolescent Gender Dysphoria Working Group. I can't say that acronym repeatedly. I'm going to call it Pugdawugda because I don't know how else to say that. So this group, Pugdawugda, it was a who's who of notoriously bigoted anti-queer clinicians, including, next slide, please, Ray Blanchard, who's on the left here, who popularized the idea that trans women are really just men who get off on being treated like women, a term he calls autogynephilia. This selfie on the left is from his Twitter reply to a woman colleague posting a study on cognitive perceptions of flirtatious facial expression. The caption Blanchard wrote reads, "About like this." yeah, girl, about like this. In the middle here, is someone named J. Michael Bailey, seen here doing Annie Hall drag in his high school portrait. By the way, I'm not creeping. I didn't go find his high school portrait. This is the picture he uses on his faculty website. So Bailey is a famously homophobic psychologist who also just had a paper on ROGD retracted from the Archives of Sexual Behavior because he never got IRB approval for his fakakta study. This retraction is especially striking because Archives of Sexual Behavior, next slide, please, is a journal founded by this physician named Green, who is the author of The Sissy Boy Syndrome. Yikes. So Archives of Sexual Behavior is now edited by one, next slide, please, Ken Zucker, here's seen here with Barbies. So Ken Zucker, who uses this journal mainly as a peer review rubber stamp for pseudoscience publications by members of the erstwhile Pugdawugda group and other transphobic researchers that would never pass muster in more legitimate journals. Zucker is notorious in the trans community for being a primary proponent of transphobic junk science and propaganda. Next slide, please. Actually, no, not next slide. My bad. Please stay on 54. My mistake. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see an open letter to Springer in which hundreds of colleagues boycotted the Archives of Sexual Behavior because of, among other things, Zucker and Bailey's constant publication of junk science and promotion of conversion therapy. Bailey, who is Zucker's frequent collaborator and maybe Biffle, described Zucker's basic worldview as follows, quote, Zucker thinks that an important goal of treatment is to help the children accept their birth sex and to avoid becoming transsexual. End quote. Bailey goes on to describe Zucker's approach to therapy with gender variant, quote unquote, boys. He describes it including the following, quote, the Barbies have to go. Feminine toys and accoutrements are no longer to be tolerated at home, much less bought for the child, end quote. On behalf of all the boys who loved Barbies, go kick rocks, Ken. Barbies are great. Next slide, please. Ah! By the way, J. Michael Bailey was the guy, you may have heard the story, who had his sex ed students at Northwestern watch a naked woman get railed by a quote unquote fuck saw. You cannot make this stuff up. So I don't think I need to remind us all that the people who are so avowedly worried about professors corrupting youth and teachers being groomers, they're all relying on and serving on boards with the fucksaw Annie Hall guy. Methinks Moms for Liberty doth protest too much, truly. Anyway, the Pugdawugda, with which all these people got started, and which served as their main venue for publishing disinformation and propaganda, it's now defunct. And sorry, find my notes. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say it's been rechristened a la Narth in the form of 3 different and overlapping organizations. I mistakenly forgot to make a slide. I wanted to have you show you pictures of these, but I forgot. One of these organizations is called GenSpect, another GENSPECT, another the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, or SEGM. Both groups have a high proportion of psychoanalysts among their core contributors, including Lisa Marchiano, Robert D'Angelo, the former Tavistock psychoanalyst Marcus Evans, and another psychoanalyst named Joseph Burgo, who's also very active on the far-right propaganda circuit. I'm going to show you some of his nonsense in a minute. Marchiano and Evans serve on GenSpect's advisory board alongside Abigail Schreier. The third organization that they all started is brand new. It's called the Gender Exploratory Therapy Association. It's run almost entirely by psychoanalysts, by Marchiano and her co-authors of that book, D'Angelo and Burgo. Next slide, please, 56. They promote a new mode of therapy that these therapists made up that they're calling gender exploratory therapy. So in this article in Perspectives in Psychological Science, which is an actual reputable journal that actually does peer review, noted bioethicist Florence Ashley, she's demonstrated that gender exploratory therapy substantively functions as a conversion therapy practice while taking pains to pretend that it isn't one. Probably my inference, to avoid being banned or otherwise marginalized. I would note that Florence Ashley, she's probably the preeminent expert in the world on conversion therapy. So next slide, please, if you can read over some highlights of what she says about this. So all 3 of these organizations, GenSpect and SEGM and GETA, they work very hard to push back academically and legislatively and at the state board level on bans against conversion therapy, because they recognize that a rational person would conclude that that's what they're doing and they want to be allowed to continue doing what they're doing. These organizations are all essentially duplicates of each other, as you can probably see. It gives the impression, to me anyway, that the same small crew of activists are starting duplicative organizations to give the impression that their cause is bigger than it is. So in light of the above, I believe it would be fair to say that psychoanalysts are actually the leading proponents of transphobic propaganda and junk science in the world at this moment. Psychoanalysts constitute the majority, or near it, of the leadership in the 3 major anti-trans clinical organizations operating in the English-speaking world. We can go to 57, please. Sorry, should have told you that. My bad. So these organizations, they're not just making lots of noise, they're very actively and successfully changing politics, and more importantly, policy. Next slide, please, 58. These organizations and their junk science have, according to a review commissioned by the dean of the Yale School of Medicine, which also included faculty from Yale Law School, Abigail Schreier's alma mater, according to this report, all of this work has been cited extensively by attorneys general in Texas and in Alabama, as well as, you guessed it, Florida, that attempt to ban gender-affirming care, classify doctors providing this care to minors as medical malpractice, for which one can lose one's license and be prosecuted, and legally qualify a parent facilitating their child's gender transition as child abuse that can lead to the trans children being removed from their parents' custody by Child Protective Services. The members of these organizations are also routinely serving as expert witnesses and consultants in support of these state-level efforts. I expect we'll start seeing them testify before Congress soon. Woo! Oh my God, I'm pretty tired. I bet you are too. Would you believe that this transphobic conspiracy is only half of what these fascists are doing to make useful idiots of psychoanalysis? Let's take another minute so you can just shake off and digest. And when we come back, and you can take the slides down, please, Jasmine. So let's take a minute. We're gonna get some water and have a little cry before I start telling you about white supremacists and Zionism and Palestine and the ways in which fascists are finding psychoanalytic scholars to pillory online for like Orwellian 1984 2 minutes hate bait. So take a minute. I'm gonna go refill my water and then we'll come back. She's hydrating. She's practicing self-care. By the way, I have the slides and my notes in front of me, so I can't see any of you. I don't really know what the chat is doing or anything like that. So please don't take me as ignoring you. I hope you're doing okay. I know that this is all really, really horrible and unpleasant. Water, coffee. Let's do all three beverages just for good measure. Welcome back. So we've just spent a lot of time exploring the ways in which fascist politics in the US are using persecution of trans people as the tip of their political and cultural spear. We've also been exploring why avowedly liberal psychoanalysts have been so central in this fascist campaign for reasons rooted in part in how central the equation of cisgender and normality are across psychoanalytic theories. And as we've seen, or I should say, we have seen how much work these psychoanalysts are doing to carry water as useful idiots for fascist propagandists, and how welcoming fascist institutions and publishers and politicians have been to psychoanalysts to engage in transphobia. These fascists are using the bully pulpit and credibility of psychoanalysts and the power of their clinical licenses in bully pulpits to fuel their war against the rights of queer people, with trans people being but the first victims. Because don't think that they're going to leave the gay people alone just because some of the gays are with them now. But this has been only one half of the story. The half in which psychoanalysts step out of their institutional cloisters and wade into like fascist politics in public via transphobia. That's only part of how fascists have made psychoanalysis a beachhead in academia and medicine. The other half is this like incredibly gnarly story of racism and the ways in which fights about Palestine and white and Jewish identities have been the points of entry for fascists to make incursions within the psychoanalytic profession and its institution to coalition split and divide us against each other and to isolate and attack our leftist, anti-fascist, and anti-racist leaders. So as I launch into this section, I want to be real with you. I had surgery a few days ago. I'm fine. But getting this presentation together almost killed me. I was up until 4:30 in the morning working on this, writing this, and I don't imagine that either you or I do our best writing at 4:30 in the morning. I had wanted to be more comprehensive about the racism side of the equation as I did with the transphobia side. Time didn't permit. I'm sketching it as well as I can, and it's pretty comprehensive. And maybe we could do a follow-up talk on this if we want to just talk about this, because I really, really have the receipts on this, and what you're seeing is only some of the receipts that I have on this crazy shit. So context. Psychoanalysis has been a white profession. If cisgender identity, understood to tightly interlock with heterosexuality, was a conscious keystone of psychoanalytic ideas about the normal subject, then whiteness has been an unconscious one. Psychoanalysts didn't say that the white psyche was the normal one, but nor did they need to. There's a million things you can read about this. Molly Merson, who I think is here, has written brilliant stuff. Natasha Stovall, who I think is here, has written brilliant stuff. Alexandra Woods, Melanie Souchet, Neil Altman. There's a book that the author's name is escaping me. She's a British woman called The Work of Whiteness that was really great. I could go on and on and on giving you citations about this. This is not an original thought on my part. White has been normal in psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis, until recently, was unable to see how weird that is, both generally and given our particular history. So, because following World War II, psychoanalysts in the Jewish diaspora, they resettled in conservative, white, Gentile environments, right? A great many of them wound up in the United States, the settler colony whose programs of genocide and enslavement inspired that genocide and enslavement European Jews had just barely survived in the Holocaust. Right? Hitler talked about being very inspired by various American forms of fascism and horrible treatment of Black people and Native Americans. These were also in the main, the people who managed to get over here, they were more likely to be high status German-speaking Jews like Freud, not shtetl Jews like my ancestors, who didn't have any money, who had been sufficiently well-resourced, right, to be able to extricate themselves from Nazi occupations and escape to the English-speaking world. There's a lot of Holocaust history by people who do great work that describes these class dynamics very well. But in Emily Kurloff's Psychoanalysis and the Legacy of the Third Reich, which you should definitely read, what we see is a picture of these Jewish refugee psychoanalysts as being eager to assimilate and pass. Kurloff, she describes them as trying to minimize characteristically Jewish mannerisms, including like refraining from speaking in Yiddish if there were any like Americans in earshot. They didn't even want to be heard to be speaking the language. Kurloff, she frames this effort as at passing and assimilation as being about religion, but I think that's a really big mistake on her part, respectfully. Jewishness was a racialized identity. Our psychoanalytic ancestors, they were trying to pass as white as part of an effort to survive and to be part of these white institutions. And this wound up being a total Faustian bargain. A full review, I think, of the legacy of how Ashkenazi Jews, like my relatives, came to be included in the category of whiteness. That's beyond the scope of this presentation. But I would direct you to the anthropologist Karen Brodkin's Illuminating How Jews Became White Folks and What That Says About America. It's a great book. In brief, whiteness is it's a flexible construct, right? It requires a demographic majority in order to function properly. Thus, whenever demographic ratios begin to threaten that majoritarian status for people who are already white, whiteness expands to accommodate enough plausible new members to boost its numbers to the needed degree. This is, as Noel Ignatieff has trenchantly studied, the way the Irish colonized people became white. It's the way in which my own Portuguese ancestors became white. It's the way in, incidentally, by the way, for my Egyptian friends in the room, it's also the way in which Egyptians who were once considered white, according to the US Census anyway, they actually came to be excluded from whiteness when Muslim identity became newly racialized as a minority status, and that was reflected in changes in the census that cast Egyptians as people of color in the US. So these new entrants into whiteness, they often bring the zeal of the convert. Because it is their first opportunity to be safely within an empowered demographic majority. See, for example, vociferous Irish-American opposition to desegregated busing in my home city of Boston, a position that Joe Biden supported, by the way. It's really important here, though, to not paint with too broad a brush. I think that some people who write about these issues do sometimes paint with too broad a brush. There are lots of new entrants into whiteness who approach it with like real ambivalence, or who don't fully understand that it's even like happening to them, or who find principled ways to be in Ignatieff's memorable phrase, traitors to whiteness. Ignatieff, after he died, they posthumously published a book of his called Treason to Whiteness is Loyalty to Humanity, which I would highly recommend. He also was part of my union, my local union, the Mass State College Association. Go Noel, RIP. But these traitors to whiteness were not, on the whole, the people who came to populate psychoanalytic institutes. Psychoanalytic institutes attracted people who wanted a comfortable professional life, who wanted a position of authority, who were eager to be the peers of white conservative physicians, who were often just like casual bigots. By the way, I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and my white grandfather was a psychoanalyst. I know all of his friends. I love many of these people. They were total casual bigots. The way they talked about Black people was atrocious. This is all to say that psychoanalysis in America was composed almost exclusively of two groups of white people. One, longstanding Yankees, like my grandfather, steeped in white American racism, and new entrants into whiteness, like my Jewish grandmother, maternal grandmother, who were often eager to assimilate in response to a long history of anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry. And this worked together with the subcultural history as psychoanalysts of being like quite comfortable with authoritarianism, because you just had to be in these institutions. So I would suggest that both of these groups of white people are really loath to fully acknowledge the ways in which their often unconscious identifications with whiteness shape their views of the world, including and especially their ego defenses and object relations. I would further suggest that white Jewish people, my people, are particularly loath to contend with this, because identifications with whiteness and Jewishness are like incredibly in conflict with each other. And this conflict is often managed through a dizzying array of defensive and ethically really problematic compromise formations. We don't act right when we're motivated by this. I want to argue that conflicting identifications with whiteness and Jewishness and the way these get defended against and managed unconsciously at both the intrapsychic and at the group dynamic level, this is perhaps the most important aspect of the psychoanalytic profession today. I think this dynamic goes a very long way towards explaining our most intractable problems as a profession, our persistent segregation, our tendency to be theoretically moribund in various ways, and the ways in which we so routinely wind up being divided over white supremacy and Palestine more than any other issues by far, more even than trans issues. If you can understand the ways in which these conflicting identifications wreak havoc, you can understand our field's problems and begin to imagine solutions, I hope. So to illustrate all this, I want to tell you some stories of white people doing unhinged, bigoted things in psychoanalysis. I'm going to need to go on like a kind of elliptical orbit to get back to this core point about whiteness and Jewishness, but please stick with me because it's all going to come together. In 2017, I was on a panel about Palestine at Div 39 in New York. It was the first panel with Palestine in the title in the organization's history, I think. I gave a paper, my first real conference paper, in which I related my work with an older white Jewish man with a severely narcissistic character structure. The paper explored the ways in which Islamophobic and specifically anti-Palestinian fantasies played a central role in his psychological defensive apparatus, and how this played out in the transference, countertransference dynamics with me, his multiracial white, Jewish, Afghan, Muslim therapist, whom he intuited correctly, although I didn't confirm it, might be a Palestinian rights activist. And I talk about how the resolution of the patient's narcissistic character structure was partly achieved through like very old school Paul Gray style analysis of these Islamophobic and anti-Palestinian defensive fantasies. I was in supervision at the time with Abby McNally, who's like a very down the middle, like Paul Gray type traditional psychoanalyst, and she really helped me a lot. So that work was such that by the end of treatment, this was not my objective, but one kind of marker I saw of progress was that his politics had shifted to be just like way more sympathetic to the plight of Palestinians, while at the same time, he was capable like relationally of some recognition of what it might be like to be someone like me with both Jewish and Muslim heritage. He said to me, he was like, God, that's gotta be hard, right? And she was like this real kind of amazing mentalizing moment that he would not have been capable of. This was like a really by the numbers traditional psychoanalytic treatment, I hasten to add. It was the sort of thing I thought senior psychoanalytic colleagues would really respect. So we were to deliver this panel to a standing room only crowd. And after the room had filled up, a white man entered the room and he stood conspicuously blocking the door. And now, Jasmine, we can go to slide 59, please. Don't play it yet though, please. I'll tell you when to play it. After the room had filled up, this guy, he entered the room, he stood conspicuously blocking the door. He was wearing a intense outfit, head to toe, skin tight, blue and white Israeli flags everywhere, including on a counter kofia, which is like a thing that's a dig at Palestinians. Sitting next to me on the panel, Laura Shiha, she clocked the guy immediately. She started writing me notes to make sure I noticed him. The guy was blocking the door and like flexing his muscles and clenching his jaw, staring her down with these like crazy eyes. He looked bananas. She was scared. I was scared. So the guy waited for us to finish, and then he started laying into us, screaming and yelling. And Lara had the presence of mind to take a video, and I'm going to show it to you. And before anyone thinks about suing me, New York, where this occurred, is a one-party state for purposes of recording conversations. I consented, so this is legally kosher. Can you please play it, Jasmine? Play it in full with the volume.
Palestinians. There was no such thing called Palestinians.
Right.
It only became...
You and Golda Meir have the same line.
That's
we
exactly
know that.
what we're talking about.
Zionism started in the 1800s. Jews started going there in the 1800s. Their claim that we chased out Palestinians, Arabs, to make room for people from the Shoah. That was 1948.
Smile for the camera, because you're making our point. Smile for the camera.
Record straight.
Smile.
You are full of inaccuracies.
Okay. You're not even part of this group, are you? Are you even part of this?
Yes, and how is this therapy?
Who are you?
What is psychoanalytic about this topic? I want to know. I want to know what's psychoanalytic about it.
Wait.
And if you care about Palestinians so much,
Wait.
why don't you care about how they oppress their own people? Why don't you care about that?
The next time we have an opportunity to have a debate, we'd love to have you join us.
It's impossible.
At this point, you're not listening.
Find out what's happening.
Completely biased.
You're not listening. We've heard you, and we appreciate your objections. But what we want to do now is to let other people talk. Thank you very much. Let's go on.
There's no such thing called Palestinians, he says. denying the Nakba, denying that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced. Even ardent Zionists don't usually deny that happened. They just mistakenly think that it was ultimately valid and worth it. A white man screaming about a whole ethnic group isn't real, that they don't exist. But there are other things I find striking about this video. Do you notice how almost everyone in the room is white and they're almost all completely frozen with eyes downcast? Do you notice how part of what people start to fight about is whether this guy is or is not an analyst or is psychoanalytic, or whether we are? He's saying, how is this therapy? Do you notice how the way someone tries to placate the guy is by saying, the next time we have an opportunity to have a debate, we'd very much love to have you join us. We've heard you. We appreciate your objections. Thank you very much. What you can't see is that the guy also brought leaflets that seem to be from Kach, which is the rabid Islamophobe Meir Kahana's banned Israeli political party that advocated genocide against the Palestinians, leading it to be listed as a terrorist organization in Israel, the US, and the EU. I forgot a slide here where I describe Kach. You have to Google it. But what you'll see, if you read their platform, what you'll see is that it's precisely what the Israeli government is currently pursuing in Gaza and indeed the West Bank. Many white people in this video are my friends. My white analyst is actually in this video before we knew each other. We've worked on that. I remember that when this guy started talking like this, which isn't on the video, I at first got very Bostonian and I was like, who the fuck do you think you are? But then I quieted myself because I was afraid of seeming unprofessional. This guy's behavior is unhinged. What he's saying is not just gross, it was obviously a complete lie, one that had been used to justify genocide, and he literally brought flyers from the genocidal political party to prove the point. In the US, the equivalent would be bringing David Duke flyers to Black psychoanalysts speak. Yet he was being negotiated with, treated with deference, invited to the next meeting, thanked very much. Almost nobody said or did anything about it. Nobody called security, let alone the NYPD and Homeland Security, the way people later did to Lara and other colleagues who held a meeting protesting IR posting its conference in Tel Aviv because Palestinian colleagues wouldn't be legally allowed to attend that conference if they had the wrong color IDs and couldn't get through the checkpoints. I'm not trying to call out people who were in that video. Again, many of these people are my friends and they were scared and confused. I want to draw your attention to the reflexive unconscious reactions these psychoanalysts had to someone who was white and Jewish, spouting genocidal rhetoric against racialized Arabs and threatening Muslim people like me and Lara on the panel. His racism was authorized and not resisted, though do not Lynn Layton in the right-hand side there being literally upstanding. Fakhri David's leader was too, but it's not on this tape. Part of the story is obviously that they were afraid of him, and I think rightly so, but part of the story is that I think they were afraid of what he could show them about themselves. So I want to tell you another story of somebody being off-the-wall racist, yet being treated as if they deserved extensive debate and consideration. Those of you who've been part of Division 39 for any length of time are likely familiar with John Mills. John was mercifully banned from the division's listserv after years of bigoted trolling. When he was allowed to post, he used to post stuff like this. Just slide 60 and play it, please. It should autoplay the right part.
Palestinians. There was no such thing.
Politics. Identitarian rhetoric is everywhere, and no less visible in psychoanalysis, where calls to decolonize the field, whatever that means, abound unfettered, yet are met with silence from the majority who have caved to the propaganda of small factions who have profited from vociferously brandishing their identity politics through social injustice narratives of oppression at the hands of whitey. Here the arbitrary white guy becomes the whipping boy for all of society's ills and woes, the new patsy. Brainwashed into thinking that all of modern culture is governed by white supremacy, white people have generically become targets of group bullying, who are called out and flogged by proxy by critical social justice warriors. Unfairly blamed for the actions of others, whitey is supposed to humbly bend over and receive fine paddling, where, "Thank you, sir, may I have another?" becomes the expected response to such hazing. The new imposed.
So he seems great, right? He seems super nice. Really fun guy. I hope if you aren't already exhausted by my Pepe Sylvia breakdown, you will recognize the hallmarks of fascist logic here. Minorities are terrorizing the majority. White people are being bullied and hazed now. It's the black women whipping and paddling the white men, and turnabout is not fair play. We can't let this stand. We will do what we must to protect the interests and feelings and dignity of aggrieved white men. There's a lot of doing and undoing in this video. Pretending to be a colorblind liberal with the politics of racial equality. But this excerpt I've showed you is the actual thesis statement. This is on YouTube. You can go watch it yourself if you want to confirm what my characterization of this. And while it pains me to think of his satisfaction at rising page views, you should, I want you to check all of the work I'm doing today. Do not take my word for anything. When Mills posted this video on the Division 39 listserv, it was polarizing, as I expect was the point. About half of the people who responded to it were favorable and defended what Mills was up to and scolded people, shouting him down as being irrational and not engaged in good faith debate. Remember the Kaufman piece about, an honest dialogue. At least one of these respondents, by the way, who's encouraging this is named Shlomit Gorin, and she now actively publishes transphobic propaganda with the psychoanalysts of Sejam and Geta, like Marciano and D'Angelo. There's a piece that they just got through the Psychoanalytic Quarterly because it was written as a response to a book review by Avi Sakatopoulos, but it was a Trojan horse. Actually, do I have that slide? Yeah. Okay, that's her. Hi. So I responded to this video that Mill sent with what I will say was one of my finest pieces of writing. I'll send it to you, anyone who wants it. It was extremely amusing. It's just too long to fit on a slide, and I don't have time to read it to you. The crux of my response is basically that Mills is a total troll, that he had been trolling the division listserv for years. The division members were too naive and credulous to recognize his trolling as trolling, and so they were constantly drawn into responding to it, and that his troll arguments were stylistically reasonable, but substantively like outlandish and hypocritical, bigoted crazy talk that was trying to bait leftists into explosive reactions that he could then use to make them look stupid, which he was very successful at doing that. He was, in other words, he was running a playbook that Rufo and Lindsay and Jordan Peterson, of whom Mills is like the grocery store house brand Shasta Cola version, all these guys had employed that tactic to great effect. And over time, it became clear to me that Mills was not just like a troll, he was a propagandist. His troll emails to the division listserv were my first introduction to what I would come to realize was an extensive universe of online propaganda that drafted psychotherapy and psychoanalysis very especially into the fascist culture war. He was using the classic strategy of shitposting and trolling to draw attention to propaganda, which is what also happened across the United States in the last 2 election cycles. If you don't know what shitposting is, go ask a teenager. I have one email from him that I wish I could reproduce in full, in which he offers this list of a bunch of different anti-woke therapy organizations, many of which I've already written about here today. I'm just going to, next slide, please, 62. I'm just going to show you the links because links can't be copyright protected. If you look at 62, here's the links. Links can't be copyright protected. Haha. This document is extremely revealing. You see a lot of familiar names here. You see Segum, you see New Discourses, which is James Lindsay's website. Next slide. On New Discourses, James Lindsay posts crazy shit like this. And like this, 64, please. Decolonization is violence. This is right after October 7th. He's really saying the quiet part loud. James is here when he says reaction is the real action. Remember, fascism is a reactionary authoritarianism. A lot of these things on that list, they're British organizations that promote transphobic junk science, often by finding extremely conservative, homo and transphobic people of color, often African immigrants, who will undercut anti-racist activism in pursuit of their own religiously motivated anti-LGBT politics. The name that Mills puts at the top of that list is the one we're turning to now. It's an organization called Critical Therapy Antidote. And Critical Therapy Antidote is a kind of fascist harbor for therapists who feel at sea in a profession that is trying a little bit to be less bigoted. They post often, and their posts are a grab bag of the greatest hits of fascist culture war talking points. Here are some screenshots that I took literally yesterday from what they posted recently. This, what you're seeing here is about a UK counseling accreditor making transphobic dreams come true and ruling that gender exploratory therapy is not conversion therapy, an indefensible outlier position, as we've established. Next slide, please. Here are the members of GenSpect, Segum, and Geta, our old friends, in multiple posts, including being interviewed by Megan Kelly. Y'all remember Megan Kelly? Here's, I believe, on this one. Next slide, please. Here is, where is it? Actually, it's the next one, please. 68, thank you. Here on the top right is Chris Rufo, hey girl, talking about his theory of a cluster B society, which I'm going to tell you about in a little bit. Here's our friend Mills, repeatedly complaining about the Holmes Commission report and the Division 39 consultant report. Wait until John Mills sees my team's discrimination study. The poor guy is like liable to have a spell and need to go to the country to convalesce. I would go take the sea air, John. Maybe he'll meet a handsome, stable boy and fall in love. I want nothing but happiness for John Mills. Happy people tend to stop trolling other people. So I'm joking, right? Because this stuff is truly bananas, and it's kind of a relief to make fun of it, and it's important to take the wind out of it. But it's also scary, right? Critical Therapy Antidote has all the hallmarks of a fascist propaganda outlet. If you follow it, you'll note that most of its posts are written without attribution, though many of them appear to be written by the same small handful of people like Mills. Unattributed posts like this, they can give the impression of a more extensive discourse on a topic than really exists. It can also allow a single person or a small group of people to like hammer an issue relentlessly without looking like they're weirdly obsessed. It's a very effective way of harassing people, which is very much what they've been doing, in my opinion. I'm using harassing, not necessarily in the legal definition of the term, but in the more commonplace definition of the term, the way that any of us would feel harassed. I could talk about Critical Therapy Antidote all day, and I'll get into more detail in the book if you want it, which probably you won't because it's depressing. But there's two main issues that I really want to highlight today. The first is this book that they published, which is slide. I'll move the slides around, Jasmine, before you click. Okay. This book that they published, slide 69, please, Jasmine. They published this book that they're flogging relentlessly called Cynical Therapies, Perspectives on the Anti-Therapeutic Nature of Critical Social Justice. Most of the videos on Critical Therapy Antidote for the last year are signal boosting interviews with the authors of chapters from this book. And the story of Cynical Therapies and the way in which I first ran across this book is actually revealing for understanding the propaganda ecosystem that I'm mapping for you. Some months back, I was asked by the journal Free Associations to respond to a paper by Daniel Burstyn and Carrie Nelson. Daniel Burstyn he's a psych professor from Duquesne. I believe he is retired now. Carrie Nelson is an emeritus professor from U of Illinois, but importantly, he's the former president of the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, and like a totally notorious person for hassling and launching campaigns against professors whose work is critical of Israeli occupation of Palestinians, from like hassling Judith Butler to hassling Jasbir Puar to like making it so that this guy Stephen Salaita, couldn't get a job that he had been formerly offered. So this paper that I got to respond to was extremely weird, so much so that I could not imagine it had been refereed. In a nutshell, it was divided into two sections. The first was this long screed arguing that psychoanalysis had been hijacked by something that they called critical social justice theory with capital letters, CSGT. They offered precisely no evidence or citations for this claim at all. They just stated it as if it was self-evident without proving anything in big, broad statements. That phrase, big, broad statements, is in quotes, as you'll see in a moment. These grand pronouncements that they made about contemporary psychoanalysis, they were completely unjustified and unjustifiable, which should not be surprising. By the way, if you want to verify this, Free Associations has it posted now, open source. Anyone can look at it for free. You can also see my reply. You'll notice that my reply to this piece is the only one in the index that doesn't have a title, even though we had a formal arrangement in writing that they would publish my piece as is. They didn't publish the title of my piece, which the title was bullshit, ! So I'm going to let Burstyn describe his level of familiarity with contemporary psychoanalysis to you himself. This video, which I'll tell you to play in a sec, Jasmine, this is from an online event that was posted on Critical Therapy Antidote, in which Burstyn read the paper I was asked to respond to virtually verbatim. So let's play that video from slide 70, please.
psychoanalysis and and psychoanalytic theory and the relationship to critical social justice theory?
Well, to be honest with you, Eileen, I'm not really all that well versed in contemporary psychoanalysis.
Okay.
I devoted much of my career to studying the history of psychoanalysis, but and I am interested and engaged with various schools of contemporary psychoanalysis, but I'm not. I wouldn't feel comfortable making big, broad statements along these lines.
This is my favorite thing that's happened. You know, I was too shady to miss the chance to play you that shit. It just delights me beyond measure. And I just, we're talking women of color in the audience, right? Like, you know, any of my browns and femmes. Do you think you'd be invited to publish your completely baseless opinions about a topic you knew nothing about in a peer-reviewed journal, even after admitting that you were not all that well versed in the topic about which you were making such sententious, big, broad statements and pronouncements at an event attended by the editor of the journal? The audacity, right? So the second half of this essay that Burstyn and Nelson wrote was just like a libelous racist hit job on Lara Shihab, one that was full of demonstrably like erroneous factual statements that were made up and strikingly Islamophobic material. It was obvious that the first half of the paper was the pretext for the second. They wanted, it appeared to me, to get a hit job on Lara published in a peer-reviewed journal, and this manufactured concern about a non-existent critical social justice theory, this was their Trojan horse into a weak journal. Neither author knew anything or had any real credentials about their putative topic. They invented the issue so that they could use Lara as a case in point, and the editors didn't stop them. Reviewing this manuscript was also an odd experience, in part because in the first version I received, they sent me multiple different versions over time, unprofessional. There were like basically no citations at all, like very, very, very few. They only cited 2 books. They cited Lara and Stevens' Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, which they relentlessly misquoted. Like they apparently made up fake quotations because evidently they didn't know that you can search an ebook, like do like a term search and verify if something is actually quoted in the book or not. And I did that, and the things that they attributed to them were not in the book. So they did that bullshit with Lara and Stevens' book, and then the only other book that they quoted is this book, Cynical Therapies. Right? I couldn't find this book in any library. I'm lucky I have access to the UPenn library, which has everything. So I had to buy it. I bought it used so they wouldn't get my money. This is a very strange book. It's masquerading as an academic book, but it isn't one. Look at the cover. I showed it to you on the slide, but you can also look at the spine here. Notice anything, book people? No publisher's hallmark on this book. That's because this book was self-published by a vanity press in Australia called Ocean Reeve, probably at considerable personal expense to somebody, because when I wrote Ocean Reeve and asked how much it would cost to publish something like this, they quoted me just shy of $4,000 US paid up front. A number of authors of chapters in this book are people you've already met today, including Marciano, Ayad, O'Malley. It's also a weird book because it seems to be a de facto sequel of another book with a nearly identical title. Next slide, please. So this book, Cynical Therapies, is functionally a sequel of a 2020 book called Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and How This Harms Everyone. The authors of this book are one Helen Pluckrose, and drumroll please, next slide, our friend James. Welcome back, James. We missed you desperately. This is not the first collab between Pluckrose and James Lindsay. They got together in 2017 for that hoax that I told you about, in which they identified niche journals with weak peer reviews that they could hack to publish nonsense articles to embarrass the fields. By the way, they called this an academic study, and then their only collaborator, who was actually a professor, Peter Boghossian, was disciplined by his school for not getting IRB for it, even though they called it a study with human subjects. This was, I think, how these guys realized that they and their fellow propagandists could hack weak peer reviews for other purposes too. That's my theory. the titular and thematic similarities to cynical theories are not the end of things. This book, Cynical Therapies, is dedicated to Helen Pluckrose. Next slide, you can see that dedication. I want to draw your attention to the bit where they say, although they are not, many people have contributed helpful contributions to these authors' chapters. Although they are not identified by name here, they know who they are. Have you ever seen something like that in the acknowledgements of an academic book? Like, James, you there, James? I sense your presence, James. Speak to me from beyond the veil. P.S. Cynical Theories, like When Kids Say They're Trans and other propaganda books we've talked about today, was also published by Pitchstone Press. I told you we'd get back to it. You can imagine how bad Cynical Therapies is, that none of these, even these outlets would publish it, and they had to pony up like $4,000 or something to self-publish it, like your grandfather's memoirs that he hands out at family reunions and that none of you read. Here's the thing. The purpose of a book like Cynical Theories is not actually to be good. Its purpose is to look plausible enough that it can be cited in academic journals as a legitimate source, as a way of smuggling factually bankrupt junk science and propaganda into peer-reviewed academic journals and articles which can then be cited to legitimate the point. That's what the piece by Burston and Nelson was doing. It was an excuse to do intellectual money laundering, sanitizing wild fascist propaganda through an anemic peer review process, if you can even call it that, in order to legitimate the propaganda as scholarly fact. You see, these kinds of hit jobs on Lara, they had already been published in loads of online venues at this point. Next slide, please. John Mills published one in a journal called an online venue called Fathom, seen here. By the way, that photo on the right is of a screen truck that drove around this year's Division 39 spring meeting for hours on end, and the photo's uncredited here, so I would wonder, John, who sent it to you. Next, Carrie Nelson also published a massive, creepily obsessed hit piece on Lara and Fathom, because he is clearly not lonely in his retirement at all. This venue, Fathom Journal, is a pro-Israel propaganda outlet that fashions itself as a high-minded journal. They also do a good impression, next slide, of being a charity. It's a little bit hard to see here, but they do an impression of being a charity. They seem to have a U.S. charitable affiliate, but I searched for it, and you can find no evidence that such a charity is incorporated in the U.S. on GuideStar. So they're saying they have a charitable arm, but I cannot find it. This outfit is incorporated as a for-profit corporation, not a nonprofit, a for-profit corporation, under the aegis of the British Israel Communications and Research Center, a for-profit company that lists in its tax returns some $500,000 a year of operating expenses every one of the last 3 years on their tax returns, but without any evident stream of income, besides a donation button on their website. The journal doesn't even have ads on it. And because they're not registered as a charity, they do not need to identify their donors under British law, where you have to wonder, where might their $500,000 a year that they're spending on their operating expenses be coming from? I can say that typically, not specific to this case, typically, you'll notice I'm choosing my words carefully, organizations of this nature are discreetly funded as soft power public diplomacy efforts by the country whose interests they support. In this case, this BICOM supports Israeli interests. I am not saying this is true in this case. I am just noting that such arrangements are common, and that it would not be unreasonable to wonder if these articles are being published in a journal that is being secretively funded by the Israeli government as a propaganda outlet. Next slide, please. Anti-Semitism at the APA, the case of Lara Shihah. Mills published this hit piece on Lara at Ario Magazine. Ario Magazine was edited by Helen Pluckrose, co-author of Cynical Theories and muse of Cynical Therapies. I actually come in for a mention in this piece. Next slide, please. 78. Hi, John. I suspect that after sitting through this afternoon, you will probably see his description of my work as a projection, as you are suffering through right now. I love to cite a source and overprove the fuck out of my points. So if you want to see for yourself, you can go read the article he's citing in the Psychoanalytic Activist and see if you think this is correct. You're entitled to your own opinion. So these hit pieces, they're not only like they're not only creepy, unrefereed writing about Lara, right? There's lots of this stuff. If you read Lara's counterpunch piece, slide 79, please, next. This one's nasty. On targeting an Arab woman, you can read Lara's account of how journalists writing for right-wing blogs, contacted her for comment about a Stand With Us complaint against her and GW to the Department of Education before that complaint had actually been registered with the government, suggesting that the complainants had leaked news of the complaint to far-right blogs before actually submitting it. You can also see at the top of this slide a fragment of the hate that came her way after these hit pieces published. In numerous right-wing blogs have used inflammatory stories about her as online chum. Critical Therapy Antidote has published loads of this stuff. Next slide, please. Here's just one example. And it's one that really bothered me for months. All this stuff really upsets me because this is my friend they're talking about, but something about this just really stuck in my craw. The photo of the burning building, it infuriated me. It struck me as a clear semiotic gesture at September 11th, terrorist attacks, all of these anti-Islamic stuff. And I ground my teeth thinking of somebody, maybe Mills, searching the stock photo database, next slide, for one that's labeled as a burning house covered in flames. But even as I sat with it, I couldn't quite place what was most deeply upsetting to me about this. It wasn't until I sat down to write this piece for you that it clicked. And I wonder if you've seen the film version of 1984, and if you might remember the 2 minutes hate scene. I'm going to show it to you. Can you play this, please? 82, Jasmine.
But even as we grasp at victory, there is a cancer, an evil tumor, growing, spreading in our midst. Shout! Shout! Shout out his name!
Nothing the party does is good. Even the world stands for good. The party wants you to believe the end of war, so as to turn your attentions away from their hateful
Next slide, please, Jasmine. Do you see what I see? I hope you see it. I have come to understand what all these people have been trying to do to my friend. They are using her for their 2 minutes hate. In 1984, the 2 minutes hate is an induction of blinding cathartic rage directed at manufactured enemies to turn the populace's attention away from their real authoritarian overlords and towards fake foes. Inducing the orgiastic hate of the 2 minutes hate is both a release valve for sadism born of humiliation and anxiety, as well as a ritual that keeps people obedient by showing them how hated they will be if they cross the regime. Lara has been made into online chum for 2 minutes hate. This is a strategy that is extremely well established on the fascist right. I will show you other examples momentarily. All the screaming about groomers and pedophiles and child abusers and re-educators you see from Rufo and Lindsay and Schreier and others, it's all 2 minutes hate. They have an unrelenting need to find leftists they can hate, whom they can fashion as the true enemies of tradition and safety and goodness. And to this end, they cultivate websites like Canary Mission and Professor Watch and Libs of TikTok to generate a near endless supply of 2 minutes hate bait. Doing this to a person is extraordinarily dangerous. It gets people killed. I want to show you a recent email from the Division 39 listserv, but emails are copyright protected, and I'm worried about people being litigious, so I'm going to read it to you instead. This person wrote the following on the Division Discuss listserv. Regarding Lara, she is an Amalekite and pure evil, as are her supporters, end quote. Next slide, please. And you can wait to play it for 1 second.
You must remember.
Thank you. So this person's rhetoric, as you're about to see, is echoed by Netanyahu. Play it, please, Jasmine. Thank you.
You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible, and we do remember, and we are fighting. Our brave troops and combatants who are now in Gaza or around Gaza and in all other regions in Israel are joining this chain of Jewish heroes, a chain that has started 3,000 years ago from Joshua ben Nun until the heroes of 1948, the Six-Day War, the 73 October War, and all other wars in this country. Our hero troops, they have one supreme main goal: to completely defeat the murderous enemy and to guarantee our existence in this country. We've always said, never again. Never again is now.
You want to know what it says in the Old Testament about the Amalekites? 1 Samuel 15:3, quote, "Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and goat," end quote. And they fucking did. They are now. Hundreds upon hundreds of infants and suckling. It's a shanda. Excuse me. It's at this moment that I want to return to these conflicting identifications between whiteness and Jewishness, conflicting identifications that live inside of me. Jewishness has been, throughout our history, a persecuted identity, one tied to a liberatory philosophy, or shall we say a potentially liberatory one. Sometimes religion is complicated. It's not one or the other thing. Whiteness is based on an empowered supremacist identity, that of the colonizer, the one who belongs to the state and to whom the state belongs, the one for whose benefit the state's monopoly on violence will be exercised mostly against minorities. Whiteness is, as I have written elsewhere, a shame management system, an ideological system that is grafted onto the stable psychological rootstock of ego defenses and object relations. It uses the characteristic defenses of narcissism, projection, grandiosity, disavowal, sadism, to manage feelings of shame by locating them in devalued and humiliated minority groups on whom you are authorized to unleash narcissistic rage. Under the right conditions, it seeks to stuff as much badness as possible into these groups and their members, and then outright murderously destroy them in a psychotic fantasy of making one's goodness permanent and complete, a final solution to all one's problems. As Jews, speaking to the Jews in the room, we know this. Killing us, our ancestors, my children's ancestors. My wife is Israeli. My children's great-grandparents were in Auschwitz. Killing my children's ancestors was the Aryans' final solution. We were the ones who got these projections, along with the disabled people and Black people and Roma people and queer people and leftists and trade unionists, all of whom were also sent to the camps with us. We memorialize this rightly under the banner of Never Forget, which I think Netanyahu is debasing in the video you just watched. But what happens when a Jewish person becomes at once a white person? When these polar opposite identities collide within a person, within a community, within a nation? What happens when a stateless people becomes a colonizing people? For lest we forget, the early Zionist settlers of the first and second Aliyot, they actually called themselves colonizers in writing, and they referred in writing to the Palestinians as the natives, and they said in writing that they would need to be expelled. What happens when you finally make yourself a majority in a nation or in an institution? What happens, I contend, is enormous internal conflict that cannot readily be worked through because its sources are so shame-saturated and weighted down by the complexities of history and politics that no one will go anywhere near its radioactive, disorienting intensity. It will drive everyone nuts. One wants to be Jewish because one is Jewish. I'm Jewish. One wants to be white to be the colonizer, because it seems to be the only path to safety. So one makes compromise formations. One squares the circle. One finds ways to cooperate with whiteness and with colonialism as a Jewish person and to find tortuous ways to rationalize this as if it is not a betrayal of our history and of our highest ideals as Jews. I should note that lots of white Jews and Israeli Jews, American Jews, lots of us reject this compromise formation. Loads of us are very affirmatively anti-Zionist in our political beliefs. For some of us, this is a matter of loyalty to the lessons of our history and to politics in which we believe in deeply. While for others of us, it is a matter of deeply held religious devotion, and sometimes it's both. These differences can create extraordinary conflicts between Jews of different persuasions, as you can see. Well, I actually can't show you this video because it doesn't load through YouTube, but you can find this online, these videos that show Israeli police attacking anti-Zionist Orthodox Israelis during a neighborhood raid in which they're also removing Palestinian flags. And I want to say, grains of salt with this, right? I don't want to treat this as highly reliable evidence. Wartime material can be hard to confirm. And I find this striking. I don't necessarily want to rely on it in an unqualified way. I think you can see in these instances the special violence and rage that anti-Zionism can evoke for Jewish people in the case that I'm describing in police officers, Israeli police officers, with possessive investments in colonial power and the need to see those of us who oppose Zionism as enemies worthy of destruction. To acknowledge that the Palestinians exist. They exist. And they were expelled, and that they are being murdered en masse by the state in an instance of profound collective punishment and gross violations of international law. And that this was and is, in my opinion, a Jewish version of the American fantasy of manifest destiny that lots of us rightly see as unconscionable. This is enormously threatening to some people. To insist that a theocratic fascist state, okay, be it the United States or Iran or Saudi Arabia or China or Israel or anywhere else, to insist that these states have made themselves illegitimate and that they do not have the right to exist as a theocratic fascist state in which only one class of people are allowed full rights, in that particular way, that stirs up internal conflict formidably, to the extent that I say that sentence and I'm worried about people chopping it into pieces and decontextualizing it. And I hope that anybody who is audacious enough to do that is corrected by looking at the full sentence of what I just said. Faced with this conflict, one has a couple of choices. One can grow and accept the ethical challenges of being a person like me, imbricated in these shredding systems and situations, and you have to try to figure them out. Or you can double down, project, disavow, employ the full toolkit of narcissistic defenses to keep one's fundamental compromise formation intact. If you're going to do the latter, you need a target for your projections, your rage, your destructiveness, your shame, your sense of moral failing. If somebody canny knows what you would want and presents you with the perfect target for your 2 minutes hate, you are likely to be pacified, temporarily relieved, and to remain compliant with the state's violent agenda. That is why these fascists are so obsessed with psychoanalysis. We are an excellent source of 2 minutes hate bait. And in the case of Lara and the reaction to her by some white Jewish colleagues, it is almost too perfect. Because it gives fascist propagandists who are anti-Semitic and or actively cooperating with anti-Semites the opportunity to fashion themselves as friends of the Jews, and thus presumptively of all minorities, while red baiting and stoking hatred for Muslims and other people of color, and while relying on repurposed anti-Semitic dog whistles. If you are a fascist, this situation is almost too good to be true. No wonder they worked so hard to plaster it all over the internet, and why they are doing everything in their power to squeeze every bit of juice out of the situation. When will something this perfect come along for them again? And it's not just Lara, of course, and it's not just white Jewish people. It's white people tout court. We've seen this play several times. Next slide, please. We're not going to play it yet, though. John Mills wrote a bunch of stuff calling Don Moss and his work a scandal and a disgrace and a racist. And then Moss wound up pilloried on Tucker Carlson. Can we play this, please?
It's kind of weird that at the very moment that most of the country lives in terror, that anything you say can be twisted into the R word and you get fired and canceled and never heard from again. We're all exquisitely sensitive, trying to step over boundaries that change every day. Some small group of people seem to be able to attack anyone they want on the basis of their race, and they're celebrated for it. That's accelerating. It's getting more intense. Trace Gallagher has the latest example for us tonight. Hey, Trace.
Hey, Tucker, for context, you should know that Dr. Donald Moss is an author and faculty member at both the New York Psychoanalytical Institute and the San Francisco Center for Psychoanalysis, where he tells his students that whiteness is contagious, can be passed on by other infected people, and that you are more prone to contract whiteness if you are white. So now Dr. Moss has published a report that calls whiteness a, quote, malignant parasitic-like condition that enables the host to have, quote, power without limit, force without restriction, violence without mercy, and a drive to, quote, hate and terrorize and, quote, target non-white peoples. But there's good news, bad news. Good news, parasitic whiteness is treatable, he says, with, quote, psychic and social historic interventions, including methods of redistribution and reparations. The bad news is whiteness has no cure. As you might imagine, some are calling this psycho-nonsense. Quoting here, how do my colleagues consider this scholarship? Anyone actually take this seriously? And this, quoting, I was skeptical, so I looked it up, and yeah, this is real. And now I want to throw my psychology degree in the garbage. Not only is it real, Dr. Moss's report was published in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, one of the most trusted publications in psychology, most trusted. Essentially, Tucker, it's the CNN of psychoanalysis.
An analogy we can all understand. Trace Gallagher, great to see you tonight. Thank you. Does anyone take that kind of stuff seriously? Yeah, the answer is yeah. And if you keep talking like that, what are the consequences? How's this going to wind up? Where are we going exactly? It's dangerous. That's obvious.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News.
Bunch of smug little shits. Actually, let's not move on to the next slide yet. So actually, if you don't mind, Jasmine, we can come back to me. You gotta ask, where did Tucker Carlson or his research team find a random psychoanalytic article behind a subscription paywall? I don't know if they have a PepWeb subscription. Derek Hook, by the way, I don't want to lose sight of him. He also wound up on Fox News for talking about whiteness in a way that made some people upset and was taken like severely out of context in irrational fashion, but I don't have video of that. You need to understand, in this ecosystem, if something winds up on Fox News, it means it has filtered up through an ecosystem of fascist blogs that survive financially by getting what are called clickbacks and also social media hits when things go viral on Fox. It's a mutually reinforcing system. For those blogs, some of which we've discussed here tonight already, they have to be fed material by people in the fields they are tracking. That's where sites like Professor Watch and Canary Mission and Critical Therapy Antidote come in. These are mines for material for 2 minutes hate. Some of our fascist sympathizing colleagues are the miners, working within the profession to supply the fascists trying to destroy us from without. I think you can imagine how scared I am of what might happen to me next. I was afraid to record this. I've chosen my words very carefully. I am very vigorously poking the hell out of every available bear. I don't imagine it will end well for me. I'm afraid for my family, for my kids. Unfortunately, I won't be the only one on the shit end of this particular stick. We're about to all be in this together, even more than we already are right now. You won't be surprised to hear it, but you should be horrified anyway. All the fascists I've talked about above, they've picked a new target. They're moving on from the teachers, and they're targeting the therapists. They're coming for us, for you. Next slide, please, Jasmine. A few weeks back, Chris Rufo posted this on his Twitter. What this should tell you is that Rufo, or more likely his aides at the Manhattan Institute, are trawling through the hundreds of pages of the APA conference program to find what they think are cringy queers to put up on Twitter for 2 minutes hate. One imagines that part of the inspiration for this might have been the slavering right-wing coverage of the Division 39 spring meeting in the New York Post and the Wall Street Journal. Next slide, please. When's the last time a psychoanalytic conference made it into the New York Post and the Wall Street Journal? As co-chair of that conference with the incomparable Mary Kim Brewster, hi Mary, I can only say, sorry for being iconic and hot and having really good taste. By the way, you notice that truck with pictures of Lara and Stephen calling them anti-Semites? These have been all over campuses around the country following Gaza protests. So these groups, they beta tested their shit on psychoanalysis. Next slide, please. 88. Rufo also recently posted this on his Substack, this video about what he calls the Cluster B Society, a video in which he accuses all of his leftist enemies as having variations on the theme of Cluster B disorders. He's obviously not a psychologist, and Cluster B is a pretty inside baseball term. So you got to wonder where he's getting this from. One hypothesis, next please, is from the psychoanalyst Burgo, who we talked about before, who also writes about this. By the way, that website that Burgo's article is posted on, that he's advertising on Twitter, the Daily Caller was started by Tucker Carlson. It's Tucker Carlson's erstwhile website. I think you could also infer that he's like doing a bizarro world version of the logic propagated by their much loathed psychoanalytic scholars of whiteness, whose work they clearly know about, from Don Moss to Derek Hook to Lara Shihatsu. For all I know, me. I think I'm probably in the clear. My papers on this are coming out in SGS, but they're not out yet, so something to look forward to. The paper I have coming out in SGS is called "Whiteness Catalyzes Character Disorder and Mass Violence," and it's a doozy. Next slide, please. 90. Thank you. This is the cover of Abigail Schreier's new book and the blurb from the publisher. You see, I want to give people a second to watch that or look at the title there, Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. Next slide, please, 91. In the description from her Substack, she says it's been 2 years in the making. The book isn't out until February of 2024, so obviously one can't know what it argues beyond what I show you here. But what seems most plausible to me is that Schreier has cannily recognized that it is the therapists, and specifically the psychoanalysts, who are getting the most traction and attention in the fight over trans rights. This book seems to take the core and evidence-free proposition of transphobic psychoanalysts, that it is the shrinks who are transing the kids through unquestioning affirmation and ideological indoctrination. And it seems to ramify this out to account for all manner of fascist grievances. So I'm going to do a really, really bad impression right now of Bill Hader's SNL character of Stefan and say, this book has everything: scary doctors, social emotional learning, victim mentalities, mentally ill enemies, innocent children, Chinese TikTok, commie professors, self-serving groomers, stupid experts, parents who know best, and even, next slide, please, DJ Truth Fairy. We can take the slides down for now, Jasmine, and we won't need them until the end. When Christopher Rufo and Abigail Schreier are both on the same shit, you know that a propaganda earthquake is coming. What these developments indicate to me as someone who has been studying these issues for years is that our profession is in the crosshairs, that we're not remotely ready for the onslaught that is to come, and that if we don't get ready fast, we're totally fucked. It's critical here to understand the play that Rufo, Schreier, and inevitably the full army of fascist propagandists are about to run on us. Fortunately, it's very easy to predict because they just spent the last 3 years running it on teachers and plastering it all over the news. So I don't know if you'll remember the movie Enough, but to quote the movie Enough, he's standing over you. He thinks he's won, and as sure as he's a coward, he will try to kick you. But because you know what he'll do, you're smiling inside. I hope that we can be smiling inside. Let me tell you about the fascist playbook. They have propagated the idea that professionals whose role requires them to influence the minds of others are all engaging in a perverse leftist campaign of indoctrination. It's like bizarro world Foucault, and it's not a coincidence because the right wing has been really obsessed with Foucault in the last several years. To date, they have focused their energies on teachers, both K-12 teachers and professors. They have advanced the idea that teachers are pedophile groomers and Maoist re-educators. That Maoist thing is, by the way, a quote from the James Lindsay New Discourses slide that I showed you earlier. That parents' rights are inviolate, yet forever being violated by crypto-communists and perverts, and that ordinary citizens have a duty to protect children and the general public from the leftist indoctrination and brainwashing to which they are being subjected. So where's the rubber meet the road on this? Basically, they're appropriating Trotskyite tactics. They identify any meeting or body with a low barrier to entry where they can exert influence, and then they try to take it over. When they can't take the body over by getting appointed or elected to it, they flood the zone with bullshit, using public comments to take up space and frighten people into avoiding participation. Unlike even the most strident leftist provocations, speaking as a strident leftist, these fascist provocations, they're specifically trying to reduce democratic participation for everyone not in their group by making the experience frightening and draining. They drive other leaders out by frightening them, making participants—
Clear space for me to put them on.
What? Sorry, can somebody—
Can you clear the space?
Sorry, thank you. So they drive these other leaders out by frightening them, making participation not worth the emotional toll and personal hassle, and then the fascists take over the vacated spots like chasing a bird out of a nest. This is what they did to elections boards when Trump lost, by the way. Probably a lot of you followed that. So the prototype of this assault, though, is not the elections boards, it's the school board fights. It was not a grassroots process. It was astroturfed by Rufo, Lindsay, Moms for Liberty, and all of their affiliates, and they took credit for that. I read to you earlier, Rufo taking credit for it. They drove an astroturf movement for parents' rights to harass school boards and PTA meetings, lodge specious complaints against teachers and administrators, try to ban fucking books, and generally create a moral panic for the sake of the children that led to the ouster of their ideological enemies and created openings for them to take over. They have found this playbook to be enormously effective at the local and state levels, but they can only take it so far for several reasons. There's a ceiling on public support for the idea that teachers are groomers and re-educators. Public opinion polling in the last 3 years has consistently found that significant majorities of Americans view teachers favorably. Teachers are very numerous in middle-class communities. There's just a lot of teachers out there. And so lots of people know teachers as peers and friends. And crucially, everyone has lots of teachers throughout their own lives, which means that they can generally imagine at least some of us as good and identify with us as real people. Teachers are also a formidably unionized profession with powerful institutions protecting us in the workplace and advocating for us with the government and in press. Our unionized campaigns have garnered overwhelming public support, even in deep red right-to-work states like West Virginia and Texas. And you can, if you want to, read Jane McAlevy's most recent book where she talks about those teacher strikes. So none of what I just said is true about therapists. Psychotherapy is a source of profound anxiety for many people. Some people literally think that we can read their thoughts, and not just people with psychotic disorders think that. Like, that's a more common belief than you might imagine. The mean number of sessions we get with patients is 1, because among other reasons, they are humiliated and frightened of the process and they bolt. Therapy is also a relatively more rarefied process. Far fewer people have been in therapy than have been in school. Far fewer people know therapists personally, also because therapists are often pretty self-segregating. Therapists are generally pretty circumspect in public because of our job's demands, and there is far less public support for therapy as a necessary public good than there is for education as a necessary public good. And of course, even that is actively declining. Therapists are also an almost entirely non-unionized profession because so many of us are small business owners. We cannot legally unionize because it would amount to price fixing under US law. And our professional organizations, APA, NASW, and others, are shockingly feeble and anemic in their ability to advocate for us and protect us from harm. From the perspective of a member of a powerful union, APA and NASW are pathetic by comparison. We need to only look at their near total inability to protect mental health parity to conclude that they are too weak to help us with something as formidable as this. So imagine then that you're a fascist who has used the anti-teacher playbook to great effect. You have taken over school boards, you've gotten books pulled from libraries, you've even exerted influence on what national textbooks can say because of influencing the obscure Texas board that selects them. You know that this works, but you're hitting the outer limit of what you can accomplish. You need a new front. Psychotherapy would be the obvious target for a host of reasons. We are a far weaker target, but if anything, an even more useful one, and one that similarly raises very strong paranoid feelings among many people. We're intimately linked to the key issues on which these fascists are already fighting. Trans rights and the elimination thereof is the tip of their spear. Medical gatekeeping means that mental health professionals play a pivotal role in the lives of trans people who elect to medically transition. and in their ability to transition at all, frankly. Psychology and psychiatry also originated the ridiculous notions that being trans is a mental illness, that seeing oneself as trans can often be indicative of mental illness, that gender transitions and even dysphoria are highly socially contagious and can have a rapid onset, and that people can use gender transition to solve experiences of loneliness and social devaluation, which, that's bold. Try telling that to your average trans person, see how popular and socially valued they often felt after transitioning. It's just insane as a thing to believe. The professions have more or less repudiated these views, just as they did with homosexuality, but you can't unring the bell, right? Also, psychological science is increasingly regarding things that fascists treasure, like old school masculinity and being bigoted, as often bad for mental health and indicative of psychological immaturity. You need only watch Fox News to see how these issues play with right-wing viewers. Fox News, I wish I had a slide of this, I don't have time. They've been obsessed with the APA Division of Men and Masculinities report for years. They will not stop talking about it. They're obsessed with it. So more importantly, psychotherapy is a profession that is governed by multiple state and local level bodies that are extremely vulnerable to exploitation. State level licensing boards are a particularly soft target because they can be flooded with ethics complaints about particular providers. That's illegal to do, by the way, but it could theoretically have legal consequences, but you would actually need to have the money to fight them in court, and many of us don't. They're also extremely vulnerable to takeover by fascist sympathizers within the government, these boards. Generally speaking, licensing board trustees are positions that are appointed by governors. If you elect a far-right governor like Ron DeSantis, they can make the appointments you ask them to make. And in many states, these boards are responsible for determining what is and is not professional misconduct for which you can be disciplined and lose your license. So in the case of a state like Texas, the right-wing legislature can pass laws saying that trans-affirming care is medical malpractice, which can then be used as a pretext to strip licensure from trans-affirming providers. But in many cases, the boards themselves have broad latitude to make such determinations, even in the absence of legislative or gubernatorial action. And generally speaking, they have not exploited this latitude widely yet. But case in point, Florida did this with their Board of Medicine, and they completely fucking banned gender-affirming care for minors. You can look it up yourself. So if you were a fascist targeting psychotherapy, here's what I think you would probably want to do. 1, identify your useful idiots. Use provocative online shitposting to identify people who are sympathetic to fascist views. Start big listserv fights to reveal the partisans on each side, and most importantly, credulous people who are vulnerable to the centrist fallacy. Start friendships through back-channel supportive communication and strategize together about who's going to post what. By the way, I've seen that they did this because they have no email discipline, and they forward emails where I watch them doing this in the chain that they unwittingly forward. Start blogs at Critical Therapy Antidote. This is 2. Start blogs at Critical Therapy Antidote to publish and share fascist propaganda about therapy and see who likes and comments and shares these posts. Keep the most controversial figures off the masthead, or better yet, don't even have a masthead at all. Well, who needs that? And while you're at it, publish the most inflammatory material without attribution so people can't pin it on you. Hold online events like podcast tapings and webinars in which these people can gather and share their grievances together and build a sense of community and shared opposition to the woke. Ideally, you would have a legitimate seeming purpose for these talks, like the publication of books and articles about your talking points. Build a community of people who feel they're fighting something together and generate enough content to make a casual observer think that there is something broad-based at work, even though there's not. Make sure that this content uses a lot of liberal-seeming visual cues. If you go look at any of their websites, you'll see that they all do. It's like they all do that. Have your useful idiots flood the zone within the profession with plausible seeming bullshit. Identify venues with weak peer review systems and use them to Trojan horse your propaganda. Remember that it's incredibly easy to get a book review or letter to the editor published in a weak journal, even a review of a self-published nonsense propaganda book, and that a casual observer won't know that a book review or letter to the editor published in a peer-reviewed journal is not the same as an article, particularly because you can quote yourself making scientific sounding claims. You can still tell people that you were published in an academic journal and they won't know the difference. For that matter, take advantage of the fact that the biggest academic publishers in our field, Routledge and Springer, no longer peer review whole manuscripts, just proposals, craft a reasonable sounding proposal and then use it to Trojan horse in insane manuscript that would never actually pass peer refereeing. Host conferences with anodyne and legitimate sounding names, like Sedgem just did, and like the Freud Museum just did with the editors of free associations. in which you offer neutral-seeming PowerPoints with lots of acronyms and statistics. Pretend you know a lot about research methods, even if you don't, and you don't. Lie with statistics and trust that nobody in the room will be knowledgeable or upset enough to challenge you, because anybody who would object to this is so horrified by your bigotry that they're not even in the room. Position yourself as a savior of the neutral and balanced sciences that risk being taken under siege by ideology. Do not offer an do not under any circumstances offer an operational definition of what is and is not ideology, or of indoctrination for that matter. Act like you're saving the profession from its own excesses. Send around links, often and widely, to invite people into the communities you've been building. 4, deploy your useful idiots beyond the therapeutic sphere. Forge connections with other fascist sympathizing movements that share common cause with you. Parents of trans children, or better still, detransitioners. White people who feel offended by diversity training, which is, by the way, that was what Pluckrose ran, an organization called Counterweight that was literally just that. Religiously and politically conservative Christians and Jews, particularly hyper-conservative African/Black British/Black American Christians who are avowedly incredibly homophobic and transphobic, and who will give you the appearance of diversity. Obviously, I'm not saying all people like that. I'm saying find the people who are like that. But also, you want old Christopher Hitchens-loving atheist skeptics, people who are highly suspicious of medicine, toot court. By the way, that's the people who started Pitchstone Publishing. And it's what James Lindsay's early books were. Create opportunities for your own useful idiots to put their perspectives in front of a wider public. Aim for venues that have a veneer of respectability, ones like Newsweek, which has been sold off, stripped of any fact checkers, and handed over to anti-democracy hard right activists who now use it as a blog to publish conspiracy theories, but it still has brand cachet with elderly people who don't know that and still think it's a respectable news magazine. If I could show you screenshots of emails, I would show you screenshots from the Division 39 listserv, where people said that what was being published about Lara wasn't propaganda because it was being published in Newsweek. Search your own emails for that if you have access. Encourage these people to publish op-eds in the Wall Street Journal editorial pages, which is also a great chance to advertise your for-profit private practice masquerading as an institute. I tried to take a picture of the article that did that, but it was behind a paywall. And in online venues like Fathom, which fashions itself as a charity, i.e. it invites donations, but is also registered as a for-profit business, like we talked about, with annual operating expenses over $500,000 a year. Facilitate them publishing books with conservative presses like Regnery, InterVarsity, Sentinel, and Swift, and Pitchstone, while being sure to dress them up as aesthetically liberal and creating distance from the other fascist content these presses produce, like the memoirs of January 6th insurrectionists and the defenses of Japanese internment. Create a public relations situation in which it appears like concerned, nonpartisan professionals are raising the alarm about the liberal excesses of their profession. Capitalize upon the public's tendency to see white men and doctors as august and trustworthy. 5. Signal boost these perspectives using the platforms of major propagandists who have a wider reach. Post about the APA's woke ideological agenda on your Twitter. Get right-wing blogs to post yellow journalism about nightmarish woke re-educators. Be sure to call them anti-Semitic to be sure you're presenting yourself as a concerned friend of minorities. Encourage your heaviest hitting propagandists, the ones who have the biggest audiences and are somehow still taken seriously by mainstream outlets, I don't understand it, to publish books and articles about the excesses of therapy. Capitalize upon the panic about children and mental health sowed by the pandemic whenever possible. Don't worry about the contradiction between arguing that kids should have been in school sooner and the idea that school is a re-education camp where they will get transed and taught to hate their parents. 6, here's the next phase. This is what we haven't seen yet. Get politicians talking about these issues in therapy. Encourage these politicians to pillory therapists the way they just pillory teachers. Write model legislation targeting therapists and get them to pledge to enact it. Use your think tanks to write the legislation. Get them to pledge to appoint regulators who will be hostile to therapists and professional organizations of whom you don't approve. Try to use these outside threats to drive regime changes within professional organizations, electing sympathetic leaders who will collaborate with regulators to avoid hostility to their less political members. This will be easier because all your fuckery in step 3 made these organizations so hostile to minorities that they disengaged or quit. Break the organs of the profession so they can jettison leftist colleagues, which in turn gives license to licensing boards and universities to get rid of these colleagues too. Make absolutely sure that they are unable to organize and form unions. Make them scared to maintain the publicly posted profiles they use to make their livings. Make them afraid to have home offices like this one that can be found in licensure databases. We may run a few minutes over. I'm not the least offended if any of you have to leave because we said it was going to be 3 o'clock. And I just want to read my last couple of pages to you. And then if anybody wants to stick around and talk, I'm happy to do that off the recording. I'd like to spend some time talking about responses and corrections to all the problems I've detailed. It's been a really long afternoon, obviously, so I'm going to sketch these broadly. So as I see it, the breakdowns we've experienced along the lines of transphobia and racism are opportunities, actually, for the revitalization of our discipline. The fundamental fault lines and problems of our discipline have been laid bare by this fascist onslaught. We have been stress tested to the breaking point. I really hope that we can learn the lessons of this and do something constructive in response. I'm not optimistic, but I hope we can do it. Part of the weakness that's been revealed is intellectual and scholarly in nature, and part of it is cultural and practical. And obviously these domains overlap, but I'm going to try to treat them in sequence just for simplicity. The propaganda was only able to take hold because a critical number of psychoanalysts were too credulous to know that they were being bamboozled by fascist bullshit, because their psychoanalytic training had cultivated credulity, actually, while convincing people it was teaching exceptional discernment. People were just misled about what they were going through. And in light of this, I think efforts to establish a far greater degree of intellectual rigor in our field would be very salutary. Now, many of you are probably hearing me use the word rigor and cringing because it is so often a dog whistle for discouraging more postmodern or marginal perspectives. As somebody who is decidedly postmodern and marginal, that's not my intention. What I mean by rigor is simply the practice of actually verifying the propositions underwriting an argument in an organized fashion. In this respect, my ask is very, very basic. I want psychoanalysis to start behaving like a normal academic discipline, like anthropology or medicine or history, all of which are highly afferent fields. I would direct you, by the way, to the way the American Anthropological Association just handled a peer review mistake that let in transphobic propaganda. The way they handled it is a masterclass in how we should all be handling these things. You can go Google it. Obviously, one necessary set of improvement here is peer review, which is like a big motif today. All these fascist propagandists and useful idiots, they've been able to manipulate existing weaknesses in the peer review system to propagate junk science, and in so doing, to burnish their reputations as well-published scholars who could lend credibility to fascist political campaigns. There is a direct link between psychoanalytic failures of peer review and the fascist successes of Ron DeSantis. Marciano's ROGD paper led directly to the Florida Board of Medicine banning trans-affirming care for minors. In my notes, this is in all caps. It is absolutely imperative that we deny them the opportunity to get away with this. That does not mean persecuting people who take these views. It means even-handedly and across the board, markedly increasing the stringency of our peer review standards in such a way that will necessarily weed out bullshit, while also recognizing that certain colleagues, some of whom I've talked about today, have a long and well-documented history of being unethical actors, failing basic shit like not getting IRB, like having their work corrected relentlessly by journals because it was bad, and that their work deserves heightened retroactive and ongoing peer scrutiny. On the across-the-board side, I would suggest that we need much more extensive training for peer reviewers at our journals, expanding editorial boards to include more people whose orientations are not primarily psychoanalytic, but who are better at methods, and a call to our main book publishers, including mine, Routledge, hi Routledge, to return to a policy of refereeing full manuscripts for psychoanalytic books as a corrective. I also think it would be wise for book publishers like Routledge to engage in the kinds of post-publication reviews that journals do, i.e. a retroactive refereeing of manuscripts by authors with a history of publishing junk science, which I expect would lead to the retraction or extensive correction of some of the books published by some of the fascists I've discussed today. John Mills literally has his own series at Routledge. If this sounds draconian to you, please consider that it is merely a matter of retroactively subjecting a book to the same editorial scrutiny it would have gotten at a university press. The exact same scrutiny I voluntarily brought upon myself for this project, and that looking carefully at the work of authors whose other scholarship has been shown to be faulty, this is a mainstream strategy in psychology and medicine, as psychology in particular has sought to get a handle on our replication crisis and falsification crisis. and actually seems to be improving our credibility in the eyes of the public because we're actually seen as having an immune response to junk science. Peer review is just one aspect of fixing our intellectual problems, though. These problems aren't just factual, they're ethical. I think what I've made clear is that psychoanalysis has very much normalized bigotry and authoritarianism in its theories, and it has done so in part through recourse to junk science and propaganda. So what I would suggest is that we need to grow our theory in a way that is, one, building upon those foundations of our theory that are already the most evidentiarily sound and rely the least on conjecture. It's not a coincidence that so many of the people you've heard today are Jungians, from Marciano to Mills. Jungian theory is made the fuck up from whole cloth, and it has no viable evidence base for its fakakta grand narrative conclusions, and it functions more as a religion than any other brand of psychoanalysis. Acknowledging very frankly what the problems with our theory have been and working hard to correct these in full view of the public. We cultivate trustworthiness and credibility by frankly acknowledging our failures, as we did following the conversion therapy wars of the late 20th century. We must make absolutely clear to every steward of a psychoanalytic organization that they cannot do anything to prevent psychoanalysis from looking bad, that such self-protection is unethical and unwise, and it backfires. 3, becoming responsive to the world we all live in, and not just the cloistered worlds of Harvard Square and the Upper West Side, and the patient populations who actually most need our help. There is good work happening here. There's really good stuff, but we need far more. What, generally speaking, are the needs of the most oppressed and traumatized people in the world, the most abused people in the world? How can we find ways to work for people who are being victimized by fascism, poverty, genocide, and other forms of soul-murdering structural violence? Remember, psychoanalysis only became a clinical psychotherapeutic practice actually well downstream of a philosophy of human motivation, suffering, growth, and change. We don't need to confine ourselves to interventions that operate at the level of psychotherapy, and indeed it may be totally irrational to do so. In medicine, public health interventions are not seen as in tension with clinical care. We must be willing to break the pump handle off the cholera well of mental health problems. 4, try to braid together those evidentiarily sound aspects of our theory with contributions from other disciplines and philosophical traditions that seem likely to serve as force multipliers in our efforts to develop more sound theories and praxis. And I have a whole piece about how I think anarchism can really help us and why in that. And I have an article that I hope will be coming out in PCNS at some point in the next year. But I'm going to skip that in the interest of time in order to read to you what I see as some really important other interventions that we can make and that I would like to find time either now or in the future to organize with you around. Here's the things I think we need to do. We need to destroy these people's propaganda apparatus. What we need, and I really want one of you to start this. I want somebody to take this on and go start doing this. We need every single psychoanalytic organization to sign on to a joint statement rejecting and prohibiting the kind of scholarly and clinical work that Jen Specht, Segam, and Geta are advocating for. We need these organizations to specifically repudiate the individual psychoanalysts who are working in these ways, and we need them to tell the general public that psychoanalysts who advocate for these kinds of transphobic interventions are actively rejecting the ethical principles and legitimate scientific consensus of our fields. They need to be made into pariahs in our field, like Socrates was. We need anti-fascist clinicians, or even just clinicians who are cool and don't suck, to be appointed to the ethics and clinical boards of professions and state boards in the largest possible numbers, because fascists are way out in front of us and stacking these boards. We need to be absolutely everywhere they are, and there need to be more of us. I would also add, and I'm not going to get too much into this just for time, we need to abolish the Psychoanalytic Institute. Let's start by abolishing the training analysis first. But I advocate, from my perspective, as they stand, institutes are machines for the reproduction of the worst psychoanalytic tendencies and characters. They facilitate intellectual inbreeding, and their anaerobic secretive structures are almost purpose-built to generate sexual abuse and other forms of coercive violations. We can no longer allow these institutions to pretend that they are stewarding psychoanalysis, when in reality they are smothering it. We need to move psychoanalytic education out of institutes and into contexts that are radically transparent, lateral, and democratic. How do we abolish the institutes? We need to fucking boycott them. We develop an organized campaign by which we starve them of money and service. I have a blueprint for this. I can share it with anyone who wants it. We also need to direct our energies to leaderless collectives like the Asian American Center for Psychoanalysis. I think some of you were here. Dustin Bahagan, BIPOC Analysis. I think some of you were here. And other such entities that are radically non-hierarchical. We need to unionize and we need to cooperate. This is a complicated proposition in a profession made up of so many small business owners like me. It can be done. As we speak, our allied professions, doctors and nurses and social workers and professors and graduate students and teachers and writers, we're all unionizing and strengthening their unions with a vigor not seen in decades. In order for us to be able to unionize, we can't just be individual proprietors or we will be accused of price fixing. We need to come together in worker-owned clinical cooperatives that have sufficient scale and power to actually renegotiate the terms of how mental health is delivered in this country. In legal and administrative terms, this is more doable than you might think. Culturally, it's really hard. Cyan is doing great stuff to fight back against insurance companies. I think the world of them, but absolutely nothing on this earth has the power to hobble a powerful corporation like a union. We need to actually organize ourselves in a way that lets us exert the full force of our intellectual, political, and financial power. There are hundreds of thousands of us in this country. We can be powerful if we choose to be powerful. The fascists have a ton of dark money and corporate power behind them. We have to unionize if we are going to fight them and win. It is not a coincidence that the first target they tried to topple was teachers, and specifically my union, the NEA, the largest union in the country. They know that unions have an unrivaled power to kick their ass, figuratively kick their ass, on the field of cultural and political battle. We need to commit ourselves to fighting fascists around the world like our lives depend upon it. We are clinicians, mostly. Fascism makes our patients sick. It makes us sick. It puts our patients in danger. It puts us in danger. We must fight it with everything we have. We must take the lessons we have learned from our own fascist incursion to help other people and groups resist this kind of onslaught. And we need to hold ourselves to higher standards. Do not lie. Don't be like these cowards and pretend that you have no agenda or that your politics aren't what they really are. Propaganda and propagandists, it is predicated upon lying or dissembling about your real politics and motivations to trick people into siding with you. It's why they all say they're liberals, or used to be before liberals went crazy. That shit is unethical. It is unnecessary. Just say your true position. Be truthful and persuasive. Don't shirk. Be what Cass Sunstein calls a norm entrepreneur and convince people that your stance is legit. Don't let them push you at the Overton window. I am an anarchist. I am a trade unionist. I am a fire-breathing anti-fascist. In these things, I continue the traditions of my Jewish ancestors, by the way. I believe that bigotry and colonialism and capitalism suck. And that while I don't think they're likely to be eliminated, they should be beaten into abeyance at every opportunity. I will never lie to you about what I think, even if I don't think you'll buy it. You can know who I am and evaluate the evidence I offer and draw your own conclusions. I will not coerce you by bullshitting you and trying to trick you, because I am honest and because I respect myself and I respect you on a human level, even if you're a person where I might think your politics are whack. I respect you and I respect your intellect. And relatedly, remember that you can always be the asshole. You can always become the authoritarian. I doubt very much that any of these analysts that we talked to today set out to become the people that they've become. You can always lapse into self-justification and bullshit. Our field is hungry for charismatic leaders. You must not be one. We must be incredibly vigilant about our own narcissism and the ways in which we are unconsciously pulled towards being the worst. We also need to be a community in which we can be frank with each other when we see each other doing this. It's not a matter of struggle sessions or cult shit or 70s stuff. It's just being willing to tell your friend when they're doing the most. I know I've kept you over time. So in closing, I'm tremendously grateful to all of you who have been here today. It's always a privilege to be able to share one's work. I'm not entitled to share it. It's an invitation, and I'm honored by it. It's a special privilege for me today because I love Section 9. I'm the past president of Section 9. These people are my friends, and I adore them. And because, let's be frank, this was a lot for you to absorb. Jesus Christ, I've just been talking 250 words a minute for 3 hours. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here. Solidarity forever. But as we're leaving today, or ending things off, I actually want to leave you with a song. This is not a song for you, but one for the fascists we've been discussing today. If any of you fascists are out there listening, I want to dedicate this song to you. on behalf of the queers and the people of color and the teachers and the shrinks and the trade unionists and people who fight for what's right, on behalf of every trans kid and every kid trapped in Gaza right now. Barakallahu fik, habibi. So this one's for you, fascists. Jasmine, would you care to play the last slide? We're leaving them in suspense here. You got 93 there?
Maybe while Jasmine is getting that up, I wanted to just say a couple words in closing to everybody. Thank you so much for attending this exhaustively researched, extremely terrifying, and insanely courageous presentation by the one and only Dr. Carter Carter. There were several calls to share materials from this event. We will be reviewing the recording first and distributing what we can afterwards to the participants. Again, this event was hosted by the Education and Training Committee of Section 9, Psychoanalysis for Social Responsibility. This event was free to attend. We rely on donations and membership dues to be able to compensate our speakers equitably. Please consider joining as a member or donating at our website, and I'll post the links to our website below. Thank you again.
Look inside your tiny mind, then look a bit harder, 'cause we're so uninspired, so sick and tired of all the hatred you harbor. So you say it's not okay to be gay, well I think you're just evil. You're just some racist who can't tie my laces. Your point of view is medieval. Well, that's not how you find it. Do you really enjoy living a life that's so hateful? 'Cause there's a hole where your soul should be. You're losing control a bit, and it's really distasteful. You think we need to go to war? Well, you're already in one. 'Cause it's people like you that need to get slew. No one wants your opinion.